said we're not going to allow. So Kurt, who are the Oregon commissioners on this group? Is Jill on it?
Jill, Mary, and Mike, I thought, but Jill, I know cannot make it today, and I have not seen
No,
Mary.
I thought Mary was not on it.
What's that? Oh, there you have it. I guess Mike. Look at you.
Okay.
Should be easy if you don't make some decisions, right?
I don't know about that. It's getting complicated.
How's Scott down there by himself?
What kind of season do I have, Kurt?
Sorry. Yours is the same as mine.
I do have a whitetail tag for Union County
He's sick.
muzzleloader. So we'll do that from our cabin, which is a lot of fun. We did that last year. And that's the only tag I have, unless I get some kind of depredation or something for elk. Some kind of big archery season. He missed a 6. Yes. But our friends from New Zealand are here visiting, and he was hunting with Jim.
Okay, folks, so why don't we settle into our seats and have a go at this. Let me start by apologizing to everybody for being late here. My GPS thing went from being here at 7:30 to 6:45 to 8 o'clock to 8:15 and then back to 8:10. So accidents on the bridge are a bad thing, and the other one I'm not even sure what it was. But people had to travel here early yesterday to be here at 8 o'clock, and so a little embarrassing for me to show up late. Bob Kehoe texted me. He's in an Uber still on the airport. He said he's supposed to be here about 8:30 according to his GPS, so we'll see if he can make better progress than that. So if we're live on the microphones, are we ready to call the meeting to order? I think we're good then, is that right? Yeah. Okay, well then let's call this meeting of the Joint State Columbia River Salmon Fishery Policy Review Committee to order. We have an agenda in front of us that starts with opening remarks and adoption of the agenda and introductions as we normally do. I think it's good for everybody to know everybody who's in the room. So perhaps we could start with Mr. Warren at the end of the table, and we can work our way around and then ask the audience to identify themselves as well and any of the other staff in the room.
Good morning, Ron Warren with Washington Fish and Wildlife. I'm the Fish Policy Director for the agency.
Chris Kern, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife with the Fish Division.
I'm Murti Sobler. I'm the Administrative Assistant for Region 5 Fish Program.
John North, Oregon Fish and Wildlife, Columbia River Fish Manager.
Ryan Lothrop, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Columbia River Fishery Manager.
I'm Cindy LaFleur with Washington Fish and Wildlife, working the fish program in the Southwest Washington region.
Holly Atkinson, past Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission representing Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission on the PRC.
I'm Kurt Melcher, Director of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm getting over the crud, so as awkward as it may be, I've been not shaking anyone's hands here today. So if I didn't shake your hand, that's why.
Do you have a mask?
Yeah, I should have a mask.
Mike Finley, Chairman of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission.
Don McIsaac, Washington Fish and Wildlife Commissioner.
Dave Graybill, Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission.
How about in the front row here?
David Moskowitz with Conservation Angler.
Jim Wells, representing Salmon Stocks.
Dan Weicker, Commercial Fisherman. Tim Weicker, Commercial Fisherman.
Tim Heath, Sport Fishing.
How about down there at the end?
Bruce Pauling, the Coast Conservation Association.
Washington State.
Rob Sudar, Columbia River Commercial Advisor.
Greg Johnson, Columbia River Commercial Advisor. Tom Coleman, San Rafael. Peter Robert, Corporate President.
And how about in the back here at the front table?
Michelle Tate, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. April Mack, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Okay, thank you all very much. In terms of opening remarks, before I ask any other commissioners if they have any opening remarks, the purpose of the committee here is always a good thing to remember as we start. The charge from both commissions was to have this committee try to reach a recommendation on concurrent policies and regulations for 2019 and beyond. And today's agenda is focused on 2020 and beyond. We have gone through a lot of material for 2020 and beyond already. We have a lot of remaining material to go through, a lot of remaining issues and alternatives. Thanks to the staff for getting all this out last Wednesday, I think. So we've all had plenty of time to take a look at it. And the chore today will be to look through the issues and alternatives and see if we can't narrow those so that when we come back in November, where we're scheduled to strive to make a recommendation to both commissions, that we can make that exercise be as efficient as possible. Before I go to adoption of the agenda, are there any other opening remarks from anyone? Yes, Commissioner Aikenson.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think we're really getting tight on time. We're wanting to make a decision next month on adopting something and voting. So one of my thoughts was that we take a look at where we left off in February with the PRC recommendation that we had in February and work from that point rather than just go through what do we want for spring, what do we want for summer, what do we want for fall, because the whole premise of this this review was to make certain that we still were meeting the requirements of the policy. And a big part of the problem with the policy enactment in the last 5 years has been that we've not met the economic criteria. And so we were looking at the fishery as a whole for economic, making sure we don't have economic losses for either the sport or commercial side of the fishery. So in looking at trying to be as efficient as possible, I'd like to start with that piece of information that we left off with in February with that recommendation and propose changes from there if people want changes, but look at it for the entire year fishery rather than start with the pieces. I'd like to start with the whole fishery and then look at where we want changes from there.
And you're speaking about when we get together in November?
Well, I think we need to have some well-refined alternatives today, at the end of today, so staff can give us that economic analysis and so we can look at these proposals that we're going to potentially vote on next month, that we've given them the information that they can come back and say, here's your economic analysis on these choices that you have. So I think by the end of today, we are going to need to have proposals for staff to analyze. And that's a huge thing to accomplish today, but I think we have to if we expect to vote in November.
Yes. Well, let me, maybe, I wasn't thinking about getting into the process of how we move through agenda items 3 and 4 right now, but maybe that's a good thing to do. You've raised the question. So in general, let me say, I think the agenda that we have today is designed to move toward what you're talking about. So we have had a variety of issues and alternatives on the table since last January, actually. And we have in our on our materials here an Excel spreadsheet that shows those issues that have remained, that are currently remaining as active. In our past couple of meetings, we've gone through a narrowing process where some alternatives have been deactivated or kind of taken off the table, so to speak. We have yet to hear the analysis on some issues and alternatives that have been on the table even before last February's PRC recommendation. The staff has got some good analysis of those, and I think we do need to hear that before any decisions are made. But as we move through agenda items 3 and 4, it would be good to narrow things further so that when we do get to November and are in a position of trying to make a single recommendation, that it is as easy as possible. So for example, on the upriver spring Chinook sharing inside the recreational fishery, we removed several alternatives after staff analysis, and now there's either 1 or 2 left. We have yet to hear on some of these things, like I said, for fall Chinook, for coho, for summer Chinook, and maybe even a couple for spring Chinook. So I think we owe it to the process, so to speak, to hear the staff analysis of those, but then have a serious discussion if these alternatives should remain active for November or not. I think that's in support of your urging the committee to make as much progress today to narrow things down so that by November, when a singular recommendation comes before the committee, that we can act on that. Having said that, do you have any question about what we have to do today towards that goal? Or does that fit in with what you're saying for November?
Well, I would like to see us have some concrete proposals by the end of today for staff analysis.
Okay, we're going to have a lot of staff analysis already, but as we move through these, if there is additional analysis needed between now and November on any, quote, surviving alternative, then that is the intent of the agenda as it stands.
Yeah, and I think that, a lot of the analysis has been done, and maybe it's a matter of just putting together the pieces to know what those economic values are. But for me, the best alternatives are going to be the ones that meet that economic criteria. And so it's about the full package. It's not about whether spring or summer or fall is ideal for one group or another. My interest is, does that overall allocation meet the requirements that we're not having commercial fishermen having a deficit in economics as a result of this policy? Because that's why the policy failed in the past.
Yeah, and this, we touched on this a little bit at the last meeting as well, and I think that it would not be proper at this meeting to entertain votes on individual measures because
Correct.
People need to see an entire package. To the extent we can narrow all these alternatives down, if we could narrow them all down to one alternative to look at in November, that would be the most efficient. I don't know that we can get to that. I don't know that we should, I think we should see if there's a consensus at the table for removing alternatives that the committee does not see as fruitful as a recommendation to both commissions. I don't know, however, if we should get into I don't think we should get into singular votes on individual matters at this meeting. Let's save that.
Well, I
for-
agree, we're short 2 commissioners.
Okay, any other opening remarks? Yes, Commissioner Graybill.
Thank you, Chair McIsaac. I'm disappointed today to see the absence of commissioners from the Oregon side. This is an important meeting that I think they should be here to listen to the proceedings. I also feel that we're being prompted to rush to a decision here today. We were rushed to a decision in March with devastating impacts. We've watched this season unfold this year, and the alarm bells are going off all up and down the Columbia River Basin. We're not making escapement goals. We're not getting broodstock to our hatcheries. And yet we sit here to determine an increase in harvest. We've lost sight through this process of our responsibility to the resource of our states. We need to hold on to what we have. We need to learn from this experience, from this ecological disaster that took place, that we have yet to recover from. The bright spot was going to be our coho return this year. That has not come to fruition. We are still in dire straits on this fishery, and yet we are trying to be pushed for an economic decision on this resource. I'm extremely disappointed in that direction. We are going in the wrong direction. Conservation should be our goal. We have some of the best scientists and fish managers in the world between our 2 states, and they're generating spreadsheets on the economics of this fishery and not planning for recovery. Our primary goal is to preserve and protect. We've lost sight of that. Secondarily, I feel as a commissioner, the responsibility for the health and well-being of our departments so that they can do that job. We saw what happened after our vote in March in Washington. One of the casualties was our endorsement that provided important funding for creel, monitoring, enforcement, research is gone. I understand that your endorsement is in peril, that provided for production. The signals are there. We're going in the wrong direction. I'm not pleased with this direction. We need to get back on focusing on recovery and instead of the economics of an industry. Also, I should say, Holly, please understand, this isn't personal, but
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
We're good pals.
I know, but here we have a former commissioner sitting representing the Oregon Commission. I'd love to have Raleigh Schmidt here with me today if I knew that opportunity was available. So there's a lot of things I'm uncomfortable with about these proceedings today. That's all I have to say for now.
Let me just respond for a little bit. Not as the chair, I'll take my chairman's hat off and maybe just a couple of questions. So the concern that we're not taking care of business with regard to conservation, I wondered if you could explain a little bit more about that. You mentioned that we are increasing the harvest, that the decisions made by this committee in a recommendation caused an increase in harvest. So it was my understanding that we have not increased the harvest rates. All of the harvest rates that are conservation goals that we have been striving for, had been striving for, were not changed. There was no recommendation to increase the harvest rate. And so I'm a little confused about what you mean by an increase of harvest rate. We've lost sight of preserve and protect. I certainly have not lost sight of that, and I would argue the committee has not either. And so I don't understand what you mean by increased harvest. We're in dire straits. We're not making escapement goals. We are making escapement goals on some stocks. We're abiding by our conservation goals, at least as I understand them, and maybe we might want to hear from the staff about that. But in your mind, when you say those things, what do you mean by we have provided for an increased harvest?
Well, in 2018, we were at 2080, just broad strokes, 2080 except in the fall. Now we've gone to 3070. That's an increase in harvest rate. And the attendant bycatch that comes with it, Chairman, excuse me. And so I think that is a move in the wrong direction. I don't believe that is a benefit to conservation. And if you, I'll repeat, as this season unfolded, our forecasts are falling short. We are not reaching escapement goals in many tributaries. We're not getting our needed brood stock at our hatcheries. This is made plain. This is made plain. And to deviate from the policy in 2018 does not contribute to the advancement of recovery.
Well, not to be argumentative, but when an allowable impact is split 70-30, 80-20, 50-50, or whatever, if you have not increased the allowable impact, you have not increased the harvest, all you've done is changed the allocation of where the harvest occurs. And if you're abiding by a conservation goal to limit the take of an ESA stock to 8% or 5% or whatever it is, no change in allocation makes any difference in the conservation, at least as I understand it. So I'm still confused on how allocation, changing allocation increases the impact on the fish.
More time on the water with a gear that has the highest allowed mortality rate increases the impacts and increases the bycatch. That is contrary to the advancement of conservation.
So maybe just a question to staff then. With my understanding that all bycatch is counted toward impacts. And for example, in a gillnet fishery, if there is release mortalities, those count toward the impacts. If a sport fishery is going on and it's closed to fall Chinook, but it's open to coho, the fall Chinook released are counted for, and those count toward the impact seedlings. So time on the water does not increase the harvest rate, at least my understanding. Maybe we should just leave this as a difference of opinion between two commissioners, unless we want to ask the staff for a direct answer to that.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Don,
Okay.
I think it was important that, again, I think we're so focused on the minutia of this process that we've lost sight of what the perception is. And we've paid dearly for that with our constituents and at the legislature.
Okay. Are there any other opening remarks? Okay. What we have next is the adoption of the agenda, and it includes a public comment period. We are going to allow public comment to the extent that it doesn't disrupt the committee's ability to do their work. to gauge how many people might be interested in public comment, could I see a raise of hands of those who would? Oh, there's a sign-up sheet already? Okay, but just for my idea, I was just gauging how many minutes we ought to allow. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12. Okay, then let's go ahead and allow 4 minutes for the testimony, and this would enable any questions from the commission to any of the public testimony when we get to that, and that should not exceed the hour time for that. And we would close off public comment to anybody who's not in the room now if more people come in, if we adopt the agenda. So is there any objections to the agenda? Or any comments on adopting the agenda?
I'm not objecting, but I did want to say, again, in light of the short time period that we have to discuss and evaluate the different pieces of the allocations, I would like to see us be more flexible with the agenda, and if number 4, policy document language, if we are still really involved with looking at the alternatives, I'd like to see us push that to next month. If we don't have enough time to finish that conversation on the range of alternatives.
Okay. The essence of what you're saying is by push it to next month, is all 4 of those would remain alive for discussion in November. Is that what your idea is?
Yes, I think we haven't discussed them yet, so if we can get to those today, I think that will be good, but I think we really want to focus on the assessing range of alternatives and narrowing that down.
Well, let me just say again, I'll take my chair's hat off here. From a Washington Commissioner perspective, these 4 policy topics are very important, and so I would hope that we'd be able to get to them. And so what we do have working in our favor is the staff has got the analysis out early. I think the staff was prepared to give their bottom lines on the technical analysis, and that maybe that'll expedite things. But I do think it's important that we spend at least some time on those today, at least from my perspective, so we have a split of opinion on that. Chair
Well,
Finley.
I agree, and you know, it's not either or, now or November. We can schedule a call in between on a specific item.
That's a possibility as well.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not, we've done that many times in the past.
Well, let's hope for the best here, see what we can do. And I would welcome for the record, but we've got a video record, but we would welcome Commissioner Kehoe
Thank you.
to the table.
Sorry I'm late.
Okay, if we go with a timer, does someone have a timer out there that can be used? If not, I've got a cell phone thing that can work here.
Michelle's got one. Let's see if she can.
4 minutes?
4 minutes? Yes.
Can you monitor that, Michelle? Okay.
And so with that,
All right. She'll let you know.
we'll do a
Oh, there we go. You're all geared up then. Good. Okay, well, how about Mr. Tim Hoiker? If you could come up and speak into a microphone so we can get it all recorded.
Can you hear me? Okay. Tim Hoiker, commercial advisor, commercial fisherman. I don't got a lot to say, just sort of keep it short, but just to touch on the last 3 years of, the policy and we fell short on, so we haven't made, the economic part of it. We've all been, the commercial has been economically harmed, obviously, what the numbers say, and the last 3 years we haven't even, got our sharing. This year we, instead of getting a 30, we're like 24% right now. So we haven't even got, from what I read, it says, no less than 30, and no more than 70. Well, it doesn't seem the case. It seems like we're getting less than our share. And I don't see why we're not managing for that. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. At the last compact, you know, we were expecting to get some fishing time in zone 4 or 5, and we didn't get anything. So the fish were took up in the zone 6 sport fishery. You know, they were all caught up. So there was none left for any in us, and we were anticipated, you know, like 1,900 or something. So I mean, it's hard to manage your business and your stuff with just not, you know, assuming that you're going to get some fish, and then they're not there when 30% is 30%. I mean, you can sort of manage on that, but if you're not even going to get that, I just don't see where we're headed. What is beyond 2020? How are we going to manage the fisheries? I mean, are we going to stick to the policies, or are they just going to be? Are we not going to manage? I mean, that's my take. So.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hiker? Thank you. Jim Wells?
Yeah, good morning. Jim Wells, representing Salmon for All from Astoria. Drove down from Astoria, and I am disappointed that the absence of the Oregon Commissioner. I'd like to thank Holly for sticking on with this, driving clear over here, even though she's not a commissioner anymore, trying to do the right thing and see this thing through. Really appreciate it from you. I geared my testimony for new commissioners. I thought there would be new commissioners present, even ones not really on the panel. I guess I'll just go ahead with it. I'll try to breeze through it. I gave you a handout. I thought some history for the new guys would be appropriate, since we haven't really talked about that. And it's kind of redundant for the longer seated members that we have here today, but I think it's important. And the first page of the handout I gave you is the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife policy we were promised in 2011 and we agreed to move forward with. And we viewed this as mostly an empty promise from then Governor Kitzhopper, and that proved to be true over time. And I highlighted some stuff there, you can read it. The first paragraph is about expanding select areas. None of them proved out to work. We told them that at the start. The intent was to not remove gill nets, or not replace gill nets as a method of commercial harvest, but to provide the managers additional options, and that was a selected gear. And they had to be economically viable to be instituted. And it was supposed to be in addition to, not instead of, the existing gill net fishery. And the select areas at the bottom I highlighted would be in addition to, not instead of, opportunity on the Mainstem. And this is a failed policy in every way, and Oregon and Washington management staffs are still trying to promote it and sell it, and it's wrong. The second one is something I thought the new guys should see. It's from the Daily Astorian. It's dated 2/7/14. It's 5.5 years ago. And it talks about expanding safe areas, developing alternative gears, the good track record of gill net staying within impact usage and guidelines, drop in angler trips, drop in ex-vessel value. It's really good reading. I hope the commissioners would take it, would read it. And at the end, this is 5.5 years ago. It says, the commercial fishermen of the Lower Columbia will find themselves unable to gill net on the river and with no way to make up that income. From there, it will be a short way to bankruptcy for a cherished heritage of fishing in our region. And that was a good prophecy. It's come true. It's 5.5 years ago. The third page is our select area performance, and it's pathetic. I've highlighted it for you. This is from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the spring Chinook for 19, the second worst out of the last 20 years. The 18 catch of coho in selects was the second worst out of 30 years. And the fall Chinook last fall was the third worst out of 17 years. And at the bottom, I just penciled in where we're at right now. And the fall Chinook's 3,000, so it's gonna definitely be the worst in 18 years. And the coho is about 13,000. It's about 1,000 ahead of last year. It's a pathetic performance. It has not made up the economics. The trap, it's not economically viable. The income produced compared to the grant cost is just insane. And that's not counting capital costs, siting, permitting, everything else. It's not gonna work. To close it, the impact splits that we had pre-policy, John and Cindy both sat through all this. A lot of times we were 55-45, 60-40 in the spring. The summer we were 50-50 on harvest below Bonneville with the sports. And in the fall, a lot of times 52-48. There was even times when the commercial fishery had slightly more than the recs. It's just how it was managed. Now people sell 70-30 as being overly generous to us, when in fact it's a huge downgrade. And to talk about 20% after what's happened to our economics and fishermen is a total insult and economically unworkable. That's Salmon for All statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes,
I
Chair
just
Prc.
have a comment. Jim, I'll make sure these commissioners get your materials if you'll get them to me. The new commissioners.
I appreciate it. I'll give you some extra copies, and I
Well,
thought the
they're-
history of it was important to them.
They're absent isn't because of disinterest. They're absent with both personal and it just happened to coincide.
Okay, I understand that. Things happen in life.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dan Hoiker.
Yeah, Dan Hoiker, commercial fisherman. I don't have a lot to say. I just know that we haven't been getting our fish. I mean, 70-30, we haven't even been close to 30. I know I'm repeating a little bit of what everybody says, but I mean, over the year, last couple of years we fished 4 days. I mean, it ain't even days, it's just hours. There's only so many hours that we can fish at night. I mean, I think we're doing our part for conservation. We haven't touched springers for 3 years, summers, nothing. I mean, I don't know where do we go? You know, I mean, these other guys, they're fishing every day, and then when they get closed down, they have another species to go out and fish. So, I mean, they're dragging spinners and stuff everywhere through the water. I mean, they're fishing every day, and we're not fishing. I mean, the splits, I don't even think is fair. 70-30 is not even fair. I mean, to me, it should be an even split on that fishery, the fall fishery, but it's not. So, I don't know. I mean, we're in a down, and I don't know how we're gonna, if we're not getting managed to catch our 30%, and I mean, we're just getting our days took away when we have them to catch. But I don't have a lot to say. But thank you.
Thanks very much. Tim Heath.
Good morning. An awful lot of people are talking about the economics of this. The commercial fishermen, they're all about money. The guides are all about money. We need the stores, they're all about the money. We need to have this open to catch fish and to sell things and to make our living. That kind of ignores what's happening with the fish. It seems like the runs have been declining year after year. I kind of agree with what you're saying there. Where I believe you said that the coho fishery was still open for sport, and that's
I believe.
it's closed. It's open up at Boy 10. I had to wonder about why that area was still left open, and there's so much fishing going on out in the ocean, catching a lot of these fish. It's like they're not expected to come back up the river any further than that. This is the third year in a row where the coho fishery has been shut down for us. This year I didn't hear any I didn't hear a reason why the coho fishery was shut off. You know, they just said, talked about Chinook, didn't say that it was, I didn't hear anything about being, the mortalities affecting the coho fishery. It's something I've been expecting. When I saw that earlier, I said, okay, Chinook's gonna be cut off, I can go out and I can catch the coho that I've been looking forward to, and then all of a sudden, no, that's shut off too. There was a prediction or a warning, I'd say, at the meeting about, before last, about how the people upriver, up at Bonneville Dam, were just catching a lot of fish. And it turned out they were catching even more after it was left open. And caught, I heard the estimate of 3 times as many as they were allowed. And so that, you know, that warning was ignored. And you know, then to see that the commercial fishermen now have 7 days to fish the coho where we have nothing left on that. I was wondering how that happened and why. So they're probably gonna get a bunch of fish there. And is there a possibility after that we could open back up the coho fishery for whatever time? Another point that I would like the commission to understand is that in the sport fishing community, there are 2 distinctly different groups. One is the weekend fishermen, the other is the weekday fishermen. When you set the sturgeon fishery for 2 Saturdays, that ignored the weekday people. We don't fish, I fish the weekday because it just gets too crowded and it's too crazy out there with all the people who are rushing out because they work all week. And then they're projecting the 1-day opener for Chinook on a Saturday again. So I'd like to see when these seasons are set like that, to think about the balance between the 2. I'd appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Heath? Thank you. David Moskowitz.
I actually did that when I was managing duck hunting.
Thank you, Chair Guzik, Chair Finley. My name is David Moskowitz, representing the Conservation Angler, and submitted some materials to the Commission and staff yesterday. So hopefully you will have those, and if you don't, let me know. I'll make sure I get it to Michelle. We really appreciate the statement from Commissioner Graybill, and we believe that conservation is, while it may be an aspect that we believe we're meeting conservation goals by having a specific allocation, specific harvest rates, meeting broodstock, and we just assume that wild fish are making it back to their natal rivers and spawning successfully and depositing enough eggs for the next generation. And this program, while it is focused on economics, it does have conservation objectives, and we believe that they get short shrift in this policy. And the section of the law talks about, and this is under the adaptive management portion, if economic, commercial harvest, or conservation objectives related to the management and reform are not met, then by rule the Commission must provide for adaptive management actions that are designed to efficiently achieve the respective economic, harvest, or conservation objectives, including but not limited to, and then there's 3 examples, A, B, and C. None of those examples are conservation oriented, and I think the lack of conservation language in that section affects the implementation of this entire law. Because if we don't protect these fish that are coming back, whether they're lower river tulies or upriver brights or sockeye bound for the Washington Canadian border, these allocation numbers are going to mean nothing, because 70% of 0 is 0. We believe that there needs to be elements of adaptive management that address the conservation needs of these species. And part of that, to answer these questions about how well these wild fish are doing, it's going to take a recommitment of monitoring on observation of our spawning success, spawning escapement. And we believe that there also needs to be more commitment to the monitoring and observation of the creel, of the effort. We have a lot of hatchery fish apparently are unmarked, so we try to use that as a way to be selective, but not enough of these fish are marked, and therefore we're not quite sure about what our impacts are in terms of catch and release, mortality. The other areas that are important are establishing, because these numbers are so low, we need to get into how we fish and where we fish to really institute the conservation measures. And we believe cold water refugia need to be part of that discussion. Oregon has made some effort to do that, and we appreciate that, but many of these cold water refugia are on the Washington side. The Washington Commission must take that up. We are fishing in a river that's very warm, and the fish are congregating there. And I don't think we have a very good handle on how our angling, intensive angling, is affecting that, especially when you have to release so many of these fish that can't be retained. Conservation has to be a bigger part of this. We believe the law allows you to do that. The rules, and in conclusion, the guiding principles for this, the first 4 are kind of conservation oriented, but there's a lack of specificity and objectives and measurable criteria in those administrative rules on the Oregon side for this, and we think that contributes to kind of failing to meet the conservation objectives of this plan. We realize there's a lot at stake for communities, commercial and recreational sport business communities, but this has got to be about the fish. And I'm happy to take any questions. Appreciate the opportunity. Look forward to listening to staff today.
Any questions for Mr. Moskowitz? I do have one question, and thank you for your testimony too on a variety of levels. At the beginning, you mentioned something that I thought sounded like the current plan is failing to achieve conservation goals. We've got a lot of Endangered Species Act populations where the conservation goal is to limit the fishery impacts to a level, very small level, a level that has been approved by the National Marine Fisheries Service as not to jeopardize the existence of the fish. Can you provide us a perspective on what goals, what conservation goals the current policies are, by their design, failing to achieve?
Commissioner Isaac and members of the bi-state panel, I'm going to develop a more complete answer, but and distribute that to you. But if we look at what happened, if we take just this year, for example, and it's been brought up by several other people, the fishery in the Columbia on the sport side exceeded its harvest quota, its impact rate, by multiple numbers. So, and if you look at the numbers of fish coming back since about 2016 in particular, we are not we're not seeing increases in wild listed fish getting back to their natal rivers, whether that's Snake River, Fall Chinook, whether that is Lower River Tules. But we exceeded that limit, the limit that NOAA set for this Columbia fishery. And those are set based on trying to protect these returning wild fish, listed fish. We're targeting hatchery fish, we're targeting abundant upriver brights. there's several different limiting factors. The steelhead are limiting stock, the tules are limiting stock, the chum, as well as the upriver brights. You have low numbers returning, and yet we are exceeding the harvest rate. How do you meet recovery goals if you're exceeding the harvest rate? We all know there's multiple factors affecting these returns, whether it be predation, marine, ocean conditions. But harvest, when it exceeds the rate, is another one of those problems. And the other area is in our hatchery production. Even though there are lower releases than historically, we also have an ocean environment that is in much worse shape, and we haven't really tuned our hatchery releases to comply with the environmental carrying capacity. We're sending a lot of fish out, and they're not making it back. They may not even be making it out of the freshwater habitat that they're released in, and you can see that. You can see that this year for steelhead in particular. There's as many wild steelhead as hatchery steelhead in the Columbia, and that's been true the whole time. But if you are thinking that, my sense is your question is trying to say, we have an abundance-based harvest management system where we have a percentage of the abundance. We're not predicting the abundance correctly, and the number stays the same. The data, the surveys are not reactive enough for the fisheries that are going on day to day. We're fishing every single day, and the anglers are better and better at interacting with fish, and so we exceed our limits. And I think the numbers are clear from the fact we had to close it down, and the rationale always given is we've got to protect broodstock. So we use that as a surrogate for protecting wild escapement. Those are two different things. So I think we're failing across the board.
Okay, I understand your answer here, and maybe we'll get back to a question for the staff, but we're not into in-season management here at this table, but we are looking at policies to, and I think there's been stated interest in achieving the conservation goals. So if you're saying we've been exceeding them, then maybe the policy needs some sort of buffering or something to accomplish. If we've got a consistent pattern of exceeding, that's not a good thing. And that's what I hear you saying, and we'll thank you for your testimony.
If I may respond to one thing, the staff did very conservatively impose a buffer this year, and they brought it down. The forecast would have allowed an 8-point-something impact on the sports side, and they pre-season reduced that to try to extend the fishery. And I believe we exceeded, and John North and Ryan can confirm this, but I think we blew right past that. And that, I think it's hard because we don't have the ability to measure the fishery impacts as quickly as we need to, because it's every single day people are out there, and anglers are on their phones. They are shifting their efforts to where the fishing is good. Why wouldn't you? Those are some, and we believe that some of those issues need to be addressed, because when you want to fish, you're going to find the best place, the best time, and you're going to make it happen. And you're always hopeful. That's what we're all hopeful about getting on these fish. But thank you.
Thank you. Robert Sudar.
Robert Sudar, a commercial advisor. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Listening to what's been said, I think it's pretty clear that the policy isn't working, and the policy isn't working because it didn't have anything to do with conservation. There were no improvements in conservation because of this policy. Governor Kitzhaber said there were, but he didn't have any science to show that. And the policy isn't working because it's just an allocation policy, and it's leaving our user group behind. And it's pretty clear, even by what Mr. Moskowitz just said, that you can't manage your sports fishery even with these additional fish. And we haven't been fishing all year, and this is the third year in a row. We had a few openings, I admit, but basically we haven't been fishing, and you're still struggling to manage the fishery. The policy, we wouldn't even be having these meetings if it wasn't for this policy, obviously, but we weren't complaining about the economics when it was a shared responsibility. but the economic responsibility has been falling on the commercial fishery. This is not a rush process. The review in Washington started about 18 months ago. The rush process was the one that put the policy together in 2012. I was on the working group. We got mention of it in mid-August. The first meeting was in September. The second meeting was in October. And in November, they had it figured out, basically. And the policy went forward to the commissions. That's hardly, this process is hardly a rush process compared to that. It's not just about economics, it's about adequate access. The select areas are the only thing that's holding up our economics because of their spring season, and that doesn't do anything for most of us in Washington. As a buyer, I can't buy there, and most of our fishermen are not conveniently located for where the select areas are. That is not an advantage for our fishery, and there's been little done really to expand those fisheries. When we don't have any access, the public doesn't have access. And so the public, which owns the resource, is being completely left out by this policy. I submitted, and it's in the back of this, a suggestion that we go to abundance-based matrices for spring and summer. The spring matrix would look at Willamette and upriver runs, and the summer would just basically look at the obviously the summer return. I think that's a sensible way to manage these fisheries. I don't think it works necessarily as well in the fall, but I think it works fine for spring and summer. There's no reason to be leaving the public out of spring and summer Chinook. They're paying for the production, and they should have some access to those resources. And an abundance-based approach is a sensible one. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't go back to that. And they should also allow the gear to match what's in the river at the time. Trying to pin us down to one gear just makes it harder and harder for the managers to manage it. We're a very carefully monitored fishery, whether we have observers on the boat or not. You have a lot better data for our fishery than you do for the recreational fishery in terms of what we're catching and how we're impacting the different stocks in the river. There's some discussion in these papers today about sharing of unused allocation. That should not just be looking at the commercial share and what should happen if we don't get our allocation. It should also be the recreational share. There are times when they can't access all their fish, particularly in the spring if it's a good return. There's a portion held over into the later spring season and they typically can't get it. There's no reason why we shouldn't have access to that. That has also happened a few times in the summer run. So that should be a two-way street. The conservation is once again, as Commissioner McIsaac mentioned, in those values set up by the National Marine Fisheries Service in terms of the impacts on all of those listed runs. That's where the conservation lies. It's not in just whether or not you can limit our harvest. That is not the bottom line. And I think I can wrap it up there.
Thank you. Any
Anybody has
questions
any
for Mr. Sudar?
questions?
I have one question.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit in a moment about the written comment that we mentioned on August 29th of trying to open things up for written comments so that people who are squeezed to their 3 or 4 or 5 minutes can elaborate. You mentioned something in writing. Do you have something in writing that has been already supplied to the staff and we just haven't seen it yet?
Yeah, in the back of this packet, today's packet, Salmon for All, I helped author what was here, but it came from our group. We discussed it as a group, and it talks about using a matrix in the spring and in the summer. And it isn't that the numbers we have in here are absolute, but we think that they're similar to what we're generally to what was in the matrix that was being used before this policy. And the staff never, in all the meetings we went to, I never heard staff say, this matrix is ridiculous, it doesn't work. It was just, the math is complicated no matter what season you're in. And
But you do have it described in writing.
And it's in here,
Okay.
both of those. It's towards the very back. There's 2 pages, Salmon for All logo on top, though it's a little faded. And talks about a spring matrix and a summer matrix, and then some notes about what I was thinking as we put this together in terms of the logic behind it.
Okay, thank you.
And if it comes up later and you want me to expand on anything, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Heath Heikela.
Good morning. Here we are again. Good to see you. At least beautiful morning this morning, looking at the sunrise over Mount Hood, so it was beautiful. Good to see all of you. Here we are again. I'm going to pick up just with a reminder of what I said in Ridgefield, which is I think this policy has failed, and it absolutely has failed its conservation mission, which its conservation mission was to target hatchery fish, harvest them within the allowable ESA impacts that are available to us. So you talk about one part of that equation. You say we haven't exceeded our ESA impact limits, but it's really about how you use those to harvest hatchery fish within the impacts. These are the PHOS numbers on the Lewis River of Thule's Fall Chinook, which consistently are at about 50%, meaning you have 50% of what's reaching the spawning grounds are hatchery fish. If you think that the federal government is going to let that continue and you're going to continue to produce those hatchery fish, I think we're dreaming. And so what this policy was about was developing selective gears, selective harvest to hopefully target those hatchery fish. So I would remind that. The other, I think, major thrust of this was optimizing the economics of this fishery within those available impacts. If you look at SB 830, the very first provision of SB 830 is to optimize the economic value of the fishery to the state. So that is the very first lead-in of SB 830. And so I think that's where we're really missing. And I think so far your discussions have really focused on allocations without any kind of consideration of how do we use the fishery to target hatchery fish and to optimize the economic value, because it really gets at first conservation, and then within conservation, how can we optimize the economics? Examples of what your February decision did. You will, if implemented in a return of gill nets on summer Chinook, you will have less wild Chinook making it back to the spawning grounds in the upper Columbia, spawning grounds that are currently falling short of escapement goals. So there's an example of a negative conservation impact. You will have less wild spring Chinook that escape because of catch balancing. That number won't be a lot, but you will. So if you're looking for specific examples of conservation implications, those are some, and there certainly are more. I would say the comment about the PRC recommendations from February, I mean, I think Commissioner Graybill did a pretty good job describing what the reaction of those to them was. And just as an outsider, when the commissioners got named to this panel, I could have predicted to you what the vote was going to be from day one, to be a 2/3 vote, because of, you know, we have our positions on things and we've exhibited them over at different times. I could have told you what that was going to be. So to list that as now like the starting point, I think doesn't fit with trying to sell this to a full commission ultimately and get that vote. And I think that's part of why the Oregon Commission hasn't taken this up so far. So looking at spring Chinook, you guys spent all that time talking about spring Chinook. Here we have a limited number of impacts, 2%. You have enhanced these off-channel areas to the point that they harvested more spring Chinook in the off-channel areas in 2017 than the entire Mainstem recreational fishery all the way to Chief Joseph Dam. So we've worked to meet the economics of the commercial fishery there, and it's really about in the Mainstem. You guys spent all this time debating upriver, downriver allocation on the recreational side. It's optimizing the economics of that Mainstem fishery. Finally, the test from the very beginning of this, in my view, and you can find it in SB 830, was the viability and economic health of the industries, both of them. That's not a guarantee, in my view, for a certain number of fish, which has kind of been the model that's been taken in Oregon, which is we're taking a snapshot. What percentage of fish did they catch pre-policy, and how does that compare to what we're doing now? That, in a lot of places, is called a catch share system, and I don't think that was ever the intent of this policy. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Questions? Commissioner Kehoe.
Good morning, Heath. Thanks for coming.
Good morning. I drove instead of flew, though, so it's more predictable lots of times.
Well, we both made it.
We made it.
And I made it
You're
in
here.
time for your
Well,
testimony. So
the
that
highlight,
was-
I'm sure. Good seeing you.
So, I was, you were here when Mr. Moskowitz offered his testimony and talked about, conservation and how the current policy is maybe lacking specifics in terms of conservation. And his point about this year, the recreational fishery exceeding its allowable impacts. And his suggestion was, if I heard him correctly, was to maybe put something in an updated policy that talks about increased monitoring of the recreational fishery so as to be nimble enough to get the data in real time to make management decisions that would prevent such a situation from occurring. So I guess after that long wind-up, my question to you, would that be something that your organization would be supportive of? In general, of course, the devil's in the details, but maybe adding something to the policy, not just focusing on allocation like some other people have talked about, but putting some more teeth into it as far as specifically on the recreational side.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. The devil is always in the details. I will just point out first that if you go look at about the 5-year performance of this policy, particularly during the fall, you will see in most years the commercial fishery has far exceeded in final allocation what it was supposed to do. And that's just because of the way it managed. The commercials went later. So we have it this year. The recs exceeded the allocation in the policy. 1 year, it tells you fishery management is imperfect, returns are imperfect. So I don't want to jump to, base a policy decision based on 1 year out of a 5-year return. So I would say that. But generally, yes, I would say we support more information and monitoring of fisheries. We're on record about the commercial fishery and our concerns there, and would love to have more, of course, information about the recreational fishery. That requires money, though, and I really worry about where we're at with the Bonneville Power Administration in this basin, funding fish and wildlife, all of that, and it makes it so important to get back to how do we optimize the value and the revenue, in part, coming to the departments from these fisheries to help pay for that.
Okay, thank you.
Question, Heath, with regard to that part of your testimony where you said, for example, here are some impacts of the decision of last February by the committee, subsequently adopted by the Washington Commission. In the fall, I think you said something that there will be fewer wild spawning
Summer,
fall
summer, that's what I said. Summer Chinook.
Okay, summer Chinook.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you said fall.
I didn't.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll just follow that. There'll be fewer wild summer Chinook spawning as a result of the decision than there would be otherwise. Could you detail how you get to that?
Yeah. We're managing summer Chinook right now completely mark selective, from the mouth of the river all the way through the basin to where Commissioner Graybill lives. And that's part of that reason is because the Colvilles have increased hatchery production, and part of their goals is to catch those hatchery fish so they can keep that hatchery production going. By going to non-select, and we saw this about 3 years ago where we switched to a non-select fishery, we're losing the power of removing the hatchery fish and getting more wild fish back to the rivers for escapement. And I will tell you, so that'll happen with the gillnet fishery in the lower river. That's just the math of it. The bigger thing it does is having a non-selective gillnet fishery in the lower river really undercuts the imperative of asking the recreational guy to do the same thing and to have a marked selective fishery. So it really threatens, in my view, the ability to maintain that hatchery production in the summer for summer Chinook and keep that run from being listed, because as you know, it is not listed right now.
Isn't it true that the only time fisheries are allowed is when we've exceeded the wild spawning escapement goal?
No, we've been,
For
you're talking
summers?
about a return to a dam, one dam. You're not talking about the tributary escapements, and we have been falling short in tributaries of the Upper Columbia. We do meet the escapement at Priest Rapids, typically, but I will tell you the Colville tribes believe that escapement is far too low as what's set between the US v. Oregon right now.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bryce Dolly? Do I have that right?
Bruce Polly.
Oh, Bruce, I'm sorry, now I have my glasses on.
Close.
Yeah, just one letter. One vowel.
Close enough. I get called lots of worse things. Members of the committee, thank you for your time today. My name is Bruce Polly. I'm an unpaid volunteer with the Coastal Conservation Association of Oregon. I got involved with this fish politics game about 15 years ago, and I just refer to myself as a big dumb fisherman from Sherwood that got involved in fish politics. And I sat through the bi-state process, as Chair Finley did, and some others in the room have. I watched the policy be developed. As I recall, the policy said very clearly that the management priority for the lower Columbia River was going to be selective recreational harvest, and that we would enhance the terminal areas. And we would develop selective gear to allow selective commercial fishing in the Mainstem. And there's been a number of things that have fallen completely short on that, including the development of the selective gear, which seems to be completely forgotten about. Yeah, I brought it up in testimony many times over the last few years, but you've heard in testimony from staff on both sides of the river that the testing was flawed, at least. So to say that we've just thrown our hands up and decided not to do this anymore because the testing was flawed, I think is a real disservice to the policy that we're trying to accomplish here. I was very happy to hear Commissioner Graybill bring up the point that instead of this whole conversation being about allocation and economics and how much money, you know, one side gets, all you ever hear one side talked about when it comes to economics, it should be more about the fish. And we're coming out of a really bad salmon time in the North Pacific, the whole North Pacific. The Skeena River, which I used to go to and fish every year, was completely shut down for sport and commercial. I mean, the North Pacific's been in a tough place, and it's coming out of it. The ocean's full of krill right now. I can tell you every tuna I caught this summer was full of krill. And there's blue whales we're feeding, and it's an abundant, fertile pasture out there right now. But we're coming out of a really tough time. So to try to look at the last 2 or 3 years and say, hey, we had tough economics, so therefore we need to change the policy, I don't think is being very honest about the natural fluctuations of salmon runs. And I'm glad to hear, many different voices being concerned about the health of our wild returns. One of the real main focuses of this policy, and it was based on science, was selective harvest, not just recreational but also commercial. The ability to remove a hatchery fish but keep the wild fish unharmed in the river. And we did that as sport fishermen. We adopted the barbless hook rule as part of this policy, even though we were given zero mortality impact benefit for that. So in other words, if a barbless hook is better for fish, how much better is it? 1%? 2%? That was never applied to our impacts. The sport fishermen that I like to represent, I think for the most part, want to do the right thing for fish. I mean, we'll net a fish, we'll keep it in the water. We don't take it out, hold it by the gills for pictures. We unhook the fish in the water, let it swim away unharmed. He's absolutely right about, prior to this policy, 85% of the Columbia River gill netting was completely non-selective. I mean, you can't fish selective gill nets in the summer. You can't in the fall. You can't on summer coho, and that's where the majority of their fish came from. So the only selective fishery there was spring Chinook. And I hear this economic argument brought up about the reason that we can't implement selective gear. Well, it's more economically challenging to use a tangle net and release a wild fish than it is to kill every fish that you catch and throw them on a tote box. So if we're gonna base everything on economics, then the fish are gonna lose. So I think we have to be a little bit more forward-thinking than that. And his points about if you're looking at a limited resource that we're all trying to save, and we want to try to maximize that resource, we need to figure out how to fish them selectively. I believe if managers had the courage to say we're stopping non-selective fishing, then the commercial sector would figure out a way to fish them selectively and make it work. And if the ones that are currently doing it now won't, I'll bet somebody else would come in and do it for them.
Thank you.
That's my testimony.
Any questions? Yes, Commissioner Key.
Thank you, Bruce, for for coming today and for your years of volunteering engagement on this. It's been a long haul, and glad you're still with it. Concerning your comment about the development of alternative gear, have you had a chance to review the draft language that I believe was available for public review? It's draft policy language for the 4 topics assigned at the August 29 PRC meeting. There is a big section actually that deals with alternative fishing gear. Have you had a chance to review that, or?
I haven't reviewed the document coming out of the PRC. I've just lived with this for the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, I guess maybe, and you of course will be the own judge, but perhaps maybe your review of kind of what this group has, at least an initial draft, has come up with that gets at that very point that you're bringing up. Encourage you to take a look at it, and then, of course, this is a public process, and feel free to comment on potential improvements or changes that you'd like in this section. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention, that that I can say, at least comfortably for the rest of the PRC members, alternative gear is not, it hasn't sailed. I mean,
Good.
We're committed to continue to work at it. And I think you understand some of the challenges that have been presented so far, but I just wanted to call your attention to that, make sure you read it, and appreciate your comments.
I will respond to you by email directly on that.
Thank you.
If I could just comment real quickly, you mentioned about the real-time kind of monitoring of the
Yes.
sport fleet, and Kurt can back this up, but, just about every landing has a fish checker that we sport fishermen pay for, like we pay for everything else. And they have electronic devices. When they enter it into that device, it wirelessly goes back to someplace, here I suppose. And I mean, the data is available. The real-time data is available. We had a problem in the rockfish fishery off the Oregon coast of sports catching more than they were allowed a couple years ago within the management framework. It wasn't a matter that we were running out of black rockfish. We just caught all the ones that they were allowed to in the policy. And they didn't catch it in time to stop from shutting down the whole fishery. So I think it would be a good thing for staff and for the agencies to be able to be a little bit more reactive to the needs of the fishery. But bear in mind, that money comes from somewhere. It comes from sport fishermen. It comes from Columbia Basin endorsement fees, which have been at jeopardy because of the decisions made by the Washington Commission last year. And it comes from the Washington side as well. Sport fishermen need to pay to keep these fisheries going, and we will if we're doing the right thing for the fish.
Okay. Appreciate your comments.
You bet.
Liz Hamilton.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, if we're having true confession time, I've got about 30 years in this as a paid professional, and before that, I don't know, maybe another 10 years of volunteering. So it's been a lifetime of working on issues to protect fish. I actually started commenting on forest practices many, many years ago when they were far worse than they are today. On behalf of the industry, though, I'm here today to express concerns over the discussions within the PRC to implement further rollbacks to the Columbia River reforms, rather than contributing to what we consider constructive conversations about moving forward and fully implementing the reforms. I think most of you know this, but the discussions here are viewed as a betrayal of many, many years worth of negotiations and compromise by the conservation and sport fishing communities. And they're an unwelcome reopening of issues that many thought would be long resolved by now. See the gray hairs? In addition to our industry, these rollbacks have had a detrimental effect on agency reputation and agency budgets, as you've heard several times today. If I have time, I'm going to comment on some recommendations that we had about the upriver, downriver sport transfer, but I can also do that in writing later. I also wanted to comment on the time for public testimony. I would suggest that you switch it to later in the day so that the people who are here have the benefit of listening to your discussions and adding more to those discussions rather than before it all starts. You've already heard that allocation does affect conservation. Many of you heard last time when I mentioned that the release mortalities in the different fleets are quite a bit different. Large mesh gill nets, it's about a 4-fold increase in mortality release over the sport fleet. Small mesh gill nets, it's about half again as much. And so if part of your conservation goals are to reach PHOS, whether it is a science-based number or whether it is to maintain hatchery production, people like both, it is important that you use your harvest methods that have the least release mortality if you're going to try to capture wild or hatchery fish from the spawning beds. We do care a lot about conservation. You'll see NSIA working in many, many other venues than this one and then harvest. And in fact, we really like it that way because it protects our future when we're working on wild fish protections. But I want to remind folks that I haven't heard a single word about the certainty of the economics in our industry. And the policy, as has been pointed out many times, needs to be based on conservation, but it also needs to be based on economics. So when there are conversations about increasing non-selective gill nets in the Mainstem on mixed stock, ESA-listed fish, not only does it have an effect on wild fish recovery, it has an effect on the economics of our industry. I would like to reiterate something. I think you guys are all smart enough to know this, but to reiterate what Heath mentioned earlier about the where the sport share is right now in the fall. First of all, no one's gone over any of the harvest allocation impacts. The sport share has gone slightly over preseason predictions, but as Heath pointed out, in most years it's a flip, and in most years the commercial fleet harvests more fish than the sport fleet does in the Mainstem. So I want to just remind folks, this is hard and I say this respectfully, but the sport fishing and conservation community and our legislative allies are watching this process closely. With new commissioners on board, we are hoping for fresh eyes that will recommit to the original intent, because far too many resources, agency staff, stakeholders, legislators, and other elected officials have been wasted on the false premise that our future somehow lies with increasing non-selective, non-treaty gill netting in the Mainstem Columbia on listed stocks, because it doesn't. We want to get back to the buyouts for active gill netters that do not wish to embrace the changes. We want to increase spring Chinook production both in safe areas and upriver for the fisheries that need them up there. We want to quit wasting our time and energy on this battle and move on to some of the very, very real challenges that face our fishery resources. And we want to do this before our fisheries go out of business. And I'm happy to answer questions, and if you're interested in the 3 suggestions I have about the upriver, downriver switch, I would be happy to comment on that as well.
Thank you. Any questions? We would be very interested in your written material, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment. So,
on the spring Chinook?
yes.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Last, we have Greg Johnson.
Good morning. Greg Johnson from Vancouver. I guess I came up here to speak about fall Chinook and how that might be a solution to moving this process forward. But the continued rhetoric surrounding the non-selective harvest relative to fall Chinook, and in this concept of the difference in mortality rates in the fall is, well, I'll be specific to the fall. This needs to be addressed, and this needs to perhaps from the commissioners to the staff to clarify this for you so you have a clear understanding. First of all, recreational fisheries are generally prosecuted in the fall non-selective. So they're not a selective fishery. They become selective when their burn on the Chinook is increased to such a point that they want to continue to make angler days, and in this case, they saved some aside to continue the coho fishery, by which they just released the Chinook. So it's not as if they're out. It's not depicting what's occurring, and I think the commissioners will continue to be confused unless that is addressed by staff appropriately, and I won't try to do so any further. In this process, you would wonder, with this 70-30 discussion and this 80-20, how did the staff get it so wrong? How could commercials fall so short as when the staff put this together to say that they could survive at 80-20? Well, here's what's missing. If you go back to the 2013 and beyond document, which serves as the appendix to this policy, inside of that, it shows you how they modeled the outcomes to create the zero harm in the commercial fishery. And the expectation in that document is that the recreational fisheries would not utilize 70% or 80% of URBs. Continuously in that document, it describes the necessary need for the commercial fishery to stay whole with the utilization of URBs regardless of gear. And the point being is that it was expected and modeled long-term that the commercial fishery would utilize 50% of the URBs. And that's the disconnect. That's why you can have a document that says the sharing will be 80-20 and the commercial fishery will stay whole. But the commercial fishery stays whole in that 2012 vote, in that 2012 document, because the expectation is they will utilize 50% of the URBs. So we're currently at the 70-30 sharing. We're achieving about 25% over the last 3 years. And it is true. In the larger years from 13, we achieved a greater amount than the 30%. But again, that was an expectation in the policy, especially in large years. But something that needs to be addressed, and staff is a better server of this than myself, is that the exploitation rate, the harvest rates occurring in the recreational fishery in the last 3 years are creating problems for them to stay within their impacts. In each segment of the below Bonneville fishery, they're exceeding the expectation of the preseason because their harvest rate continues to increase because the efficiency within that group increases, and that's partially why they utilize more of, or utilize currently 20% of the impacts that were available to us. So I guess I'll cut it off at that, and leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Johnson? Okay, thanks very much.
Mr. Chair, I have a question for staff based on some of the testimony, if that's okay.
Well, let's
Okay.
try it. There was quite a bit of things that came up in public testimony that probably we would all like to have some fact checking on. Why don't you go ahead, and I don't know if what I would like to avoid is spending a lot of time on the back and forth on that.
It's your call.
But go ahead, and maybe we can bring these up and get back to them at the end of the day if we have time. But go ahead.
Okay, and this is, I think I know the answer to this, but I just wanted to throw out there. So, in the testimony we heard about, conservation, and as I heard two aspects. One, obviously, is to not exceed ESA mandated impacts. That was one. And then, some testimony about PHOS, about the need to decrease the number of hatchery fish that are found in the streams to avoid, genetic dilution. So two things, PHOS and ESA. So from you managers' perspectives, what is the priority as you go about kind of planning your fisheries? Does ESA take precedent over over PHOS, or is there a mix? Or maybe kind of just talk about what those factors are when you make your management decisions.
Would one of you like to take a stab at a brief answer to that?
I'll try to start. It's not an easy question to answer. The ESA constraints have been in place in the Columbia River since 1992 when we got the first listing. So we've been doing, we're used to those, and as each additional species or stock got listed, we would, change our management and manage for those ESA impact limits. So there's no wiggle room around those. The PHOS guidelines, we do have some obligations through the Mitchell Act biological opinion to meet some PHOS guidelines. That opinion was same agency, National Marine Fishery, ESA, but that opinion was adopted in 2017. And so we are early in the process of determining how we're going to do that. And in Washington, I don't know what's really going on in Oregon, but in Washington, we're taking a number of approaches. We've reduced some of our hatchery production. We've put in weirs in a number of tributaries. And we also had some expectation for some marked selective fisheries to help with that. So that's been our approach. So I don't have an answer to does one trump the other. That's just where we are right now. So Chris wants to add.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I guess from my perspective, it is a very complicated issue when you start weighing the other, but I think the fact remains that any efforts we undertake to increase harvest to reduce PHOS have to still be within the ESA construct. So there is an inherent priority just on that, not from necessarily an overall policy standpoint, but the mechanics of it that is a foundational part of it.
Thanks. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, there was a couple of things that came up in public testimony that, while they sounded a little bit like in-season management, if we're looking at policy concurrency and an obligation to not exceed impacts, it'd be good to know whether or not some of this that we heard is unique to a year or two and not really a pattern. We heard the forecasts are wrong. I know sometimes they're over, like the Upriver Bright Run this year is stronger than preseason forecast. Sometimes they're less. We just heard maybe the Cove runs less. The commercial fisheries exceeding their impacts on a regular basis. We heard testimony of the sport fisheries exceeding their impacts on a regular basis. I'm not going to look for any answers here now because we're about an hour into the public comment period. But maybe if we have time at the end of the day, we might get back to this again. The point being, is there a pattern here that deserves some sort of policy addressment or not? But let's see if we can bring that up later. The other matter on public comment was written testimony received. So on August 29th, we said, let's offer the public the opportunity to put things in writing, get that distributed to the PRC members, and give them a chance to read it in advance of the meeting. We didn't receive anything yet. I know the portals are still in a state of development, and so we'll look forward to that later. Maybe we also have some written comment that was referred to here. It will be very good that whatever you got in advance of the meeting, whatever you have at this meeting, get distributed to all the PRC members. And inside of each agency, I'm sure all the commissioners should be, have the opportunity to see that somehow, some way as well. But maybe rather than get into a question of, you know, what did you receive that hasn't been reviewed yet? What were the topics? I think we've kind of run out of time a little bit for that. Maybe if we get back to it later, but I think one takeaway is we all need to see everything you've gotten so far, and we need to see whatever was brought up. And for those that had written material, that you could be sure and get those that you brought today to the staff, and that as we move between now and November, we want to make sure the public understands that the opportunity is there for written public comment, that the committee members will see it in advance of the meeting, and we'll have to have some sort of cutoff, obviously, maybe the Friday before the November meeting, because we can't be accepting written public comment while the meeting's going on and expect us to stop what we're doing and read it. Obviously, that would not work, and we can't expect the staff to process written public comment the day before the meeting or right before then. So, and again, we'll maybe get back to this public comment thing at the end of the day. So we're now at the point of looking at agenda item number 3. So let me bring up just a couple of points here, and we'll get started on that with the staff. And some of this was touched on a little bit earlier with the conversation with Commissioner Atkinson, but early in the PRC process, for those who weren't there in January and February and March, we looked at a full scope of issues and alternatives on the table, and in our attempt to search for concurrent policies and regulations. At the third PRC meeting, a recommendation was reached on probably most of the allocation and commercial gear issues for use in the 2019 North of Falcon process, and for 2020 and beyond if unchanged by future PRC deliberations. At our meeting here in August, there was a question about whether that rolled to 2020 or not, and we heard after the meeting that it was clear at the Washington presentation that the slides clearly said that it was to roll, and I think the Oregon commissioners here in this room said the same thing. But let me just pause for a moment if there is any confusion about that point. Okay, well then leading up to this one, we've considered some additional issues and alternatives, and the ranges of alternatives have been narrowed. And at this meeting, we're hoping to get to the remaining issues, look and see what the alternatives are. I see the staff's got on the screen that same document that we have in front of us for those with better eyes than me. The hope today is to narrow the range of alternatives as we have been doing in the past. And if there is a good consensus to take a particular alternative off the screen, so to speak, then I think that would be a useful and productive thing to do. But if there isn't a consensus or a strong majority that the minority can respond to, if there's not a consensus, then I don't think it's fruitful for us to get into motions, amendments to motions, and all of that, or we'll never get through it. So, any questions from the commissioners before we take on the first one, which is summer Chinook? Okay, well, we have 3 issues that are listed on the agenda. Why don't you guys take it away?
Thank you, Chair McIsaac. So I'm going to start off with summer Chinook, and so the 3 issues that we're going to be reviewing. The first is a recreational commercial allocation for downstream of the Priest Rapids Dam. The second one is allocation of unused commercial impacts. We have not finalized those materials, so you don't have those in your packet. It's in draft form where we're expecting to be able to provide it before the next meeting. So we probably can kind of give you a bottom line on that one, but we won't have the materials available for that one until after this meeting. And then the last one is the allowable mainstem commercial gear for summer snook fisheries. So we do have a handout specific to this. And you can just go right into the results. So instead of walking details through the issue line by line, kind of give you the 1,000-foot level. We manage, we have USV Oregon management agreements to operate off of. I have an objective to reach for spawning escapement needs for summer Chinook above Prc Rapids Dam. We have the non-treaty fishery has a chunk that comes out of the ocean fisheries, and then we work off of what's left for in river, and then you allocate, primarily most of the allocation goes above Prc Rapids Dam for the state Washington fishery, as well as the recreational fishery, as well as Colville. And then you allocate further downstream, which then, as the current PRC allocation is 70-30. So that's 70% recreational, 30% commercial. The other issue that we'll mention is the allowable gear, and the current PRC recommendation is gill netting is allowed, but obviously Oregon has not taken up that action through the commission yet. And then the two states do have differing policies on unused commercial allocation. So I'm going to jump right in to results on issue number 1, which is the allocation. So what we've done here is we've looked at angler trips for below Bonneville Dam only, as well as commercial ex-vessel value. We'll slide over to table 1, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the results before we throw it up on the screen. And we're looking at 3 different allocation options, an 80-20 split, a 70-30 split, and a 50-50 split. We are looking at the results. We're using results from 2013 through 2018, and by that I mean what would have occurred with these allocation options in those years, not a predictive into the future, if that makes sense. So we're learning with what we've done in the past, using previous run sizes, for example, to operate under. And then important note on that, on table 1 that you'll see is the 80-20. I guess we're also having to work under what gear to use for the commercial fishery. So 80-20 is alternative gear only. And then the 70-30 and 50-50 would allow gill net fishery. So what you see up there, table 1, so it is, I guess I will take a slight step back. It is a little bit of a blend of 2 issues. If you look at the first row, issue 1, Oregon status quo, / issue 3, Oregon status quo. So what that is the 80-20 split with the alternative gear. You go down below, you have the 70-30 split. That's tied alongside with the gill net option being allowed. And then 50-50 is the same. And then lastly up there is the abundance-based matrix on the table. So what you'll see there is as you increase the allocation to the commercial fishery, you significantly increase the ex-vessel gain. So under the 50-50 scenario, you would have about $250,000 in ex-vessel value using gill net fisheries. 70-30, where the current PRC policy, that would have estimated about $150,000 over the last 5 years of the policy. And then alternative gear, there is none. Part of that, without jumping too far ahead to another issue, is we haven't had an alternative gear that works in the summer. And then going back to the table as well. The other part here is the angler trips. You can see that moving from 70% to 80% has an increase in angler trips, about 3,000, but 50-50 to 70% shift. There is no change, and that is that we brought up them multiple times, is that nonlinear relationship as run sizes and catch rates and other factors have a larger effect than the actual allocation on the sport fishery. So and feel free to pause me, but I'm going to move to the last piece of this.
Then
we'll circle back.
if you're going to move off the table here.
Yes, we can pause.
Yeah, then any questions about what this shows here? I have one, and it got to your last point there. When you change from 80-20, I'm just looking at angler trips, 80-20 to 70-30, there's more angler trips at 80-20 than there is at 70-30. At 50-50, it seems intuitive that you would have fewer angler trips because the sport fishery is getting less impacts. But you said something else would explain why that shows up as an identical number of angler trips, even though the allocation changed from 70% down to 50%. Could you go into a little bit more depth about why that first intuitive thing, and less allocation should be less angler trips?
Chairman Kazik, I'll try and address that. It is a challenging concept. When we did the original work back, with development of the policy, there was assumptions made that there would be a linear gain with change in allocation. Since then, over the years and doing more and more work, what we've found is that there's basically other factors that are bigger than allocation that affect the outcome, such as changes in run size or fishing conditions. Say in the spring, if the water's all muddy and you can't catch the fish, it doesn't matter if you have 50 or 70% because you didn't catch even the 50, so the 70% didn't benefit you in that year. Now, having an allocation that's higher can increase the chances that you could benefit from that because it's there and available, but doesn't always mean that you're going to utilize it because there's these other factors. So in this case, the way we did this modeling was we went back and I think we looked at, what was it, 13 through 18, we reran what actually happened with these different allocation shares that the panel asked us to, and we tried to figure out whether there would have made any difference. And below the table 1, there's some brief explanation, but basically in a couple of those years, the recreational fishery didn't benefit because there was significant run upgrades and there was more than enough fish even at the pre-allocation share, and so increasing the share didn't get you anything extra. You had enough fish even at the 70-30, the 80% didn't buy you anything. There was another year, I think it was 17, where it did benefit you. You ran out of fish at 70, 80% got you a little more time. So it's been a challenge to describe this, and it affects every one of these tables, spring, summer, and fall. Basically what we found after doing a more thorough review is that it's not linear. There is definitely usually some gain or at least an opportunity to gain, but it's far from linear, which was what was assumed in the original modeling.
Yes, and I recall some of that February modeling, but it seemed in those cases, while it's true you can look back at a year, if it's muddy, they're not going to catch them. If it looks bad at a year where the run was much smaller or much bigger, that year it affected it. In your previous modeling, though, you normalized or you assumed, let's assume the river's not muddy. For the sake of this analysis, let's assume that the river's clear enough for a sport fishery. or let's assume a particular run size, because in some of the other years, the reason why the economics were so good for the commercial fishery had more to do with a large run size than it did a change in policy. So for the sake of modeling, let's assume some sort of normalized run size. In this, it doesn't sound like you made those kind of assumptions. When you went to 50-50, you didn't assume the same water clarity that was there for 80-20 and 70-30. And maybe you didn't normalize for run sizes. So I guess that's a question. Did you make modeling assumptions that was constant through the allocations for sport fishing efficiency and run size changes?
Chairman Kazik, I think it's kind of two different things there. In that previous analysis, we were trying to compare the results of different options, and we standardized for run size. This exercise is just going back and looking at what actually happened and would a change in allocation have made any difference. So it's using what actually happened 13 through 18, rerunning through every step of every year based on the run-up grade. You know, if we'd have had a different allocation, would we have done anything different? Would there have been a change in commercial value or angler trips? And so I don't think we've ever assumed, the only time we've ever assumed that they can get, the sport fishery can use all its impacts is in the original modeling in 2012-13. That's where we made some assumptions, not having had the experience, that they would be more of a linear relationship. Now all of this work has basically looked back and said, okay, given what you knew when, let's do a hypothetical switch of the allocation. Would there have been a difference? Does that help?
Well, I was going to ask for other questions here, but Chris, you have something to contribute here?
Well, hopefully it doesn't make it worse. I think, Chairman Kazik, your question is how does this model relate to the approach that was given to you in February? And I think the model framework is basically the same as that one. The place John is talking about where it's different is back in 2012 versus both February and now is a different approach. Just to make sure we're all clear on which one's which.
Commissioner Kehoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I have a question about the abundance-based matrix, and we heard some testimony today and in the past about some support for using that for summer Chinook, and to me intuitively it makes sense. In smaller years, it's and you can still have a recreational priority. And then larger years, of course, commercials can help share in the bounty. So, but my question, I think, is to, it is to Director Melcher. And I recall you saying that you're not wild, or you have some pushback to using a matrix-based approach for summer Chinook. But I'm wondering, I'm just reading through the document here, is that we do use currently a run size based matrix to allocate for the treaty and non-treaty fisheries under the USB Oregon Management Agreement. And so given that, maybe if you could explain then some of your concerns about if we were to go use a matrix based model for management approach for summer Chinook.
Well, thanks, Commissioner Kehoe. you know, my pushback was that there are already many variables in play as we manage these fisheries, and you're just introducing another variable. So, you know, you pointed out that the treaty, non-treaty sharing can change based on run size, and yes, that's true, it can, and it does. But having the sector-specific allocations change again based on run size just introduces additional variables that they're difficult to deal with in season. If the runs were always, you know, came in exactly as predicted, piece of cake, you know, and you never have a run size that causes you to be over your conservation guidance, which is the ESA guidance. So it's just another variable to introduce uncertainty. That's my main concern.
Okay.
Not on principle.
But just
Makes sense. It's
how
just on the
it
mechanics.
is, so just how it is, how it plays out, because you're right, I mean, there's uncertainties, as we've seen this year, about run sizes, and you know, sometimes you're maybe overly cautious, or maybe you're not cautious enough, okay, well, that helps me kind of understand, thanks. But, well, let me just say, you still have the same issues, though, don't you, if you just go for a straight allocation, you say 80-20, 70-30, 50-50. I mean, that issue still is in play in terms of uncertainty over run size. So maybe if you could address that point, too.
A little less so, and I guess just take a hypothetical example, that if you had a matrix where on a large run the sharing was 50-50, and so you're fishing on the front side of the run, trying to achieve that 50-50 sharing, and then the run comes in half of forecast, which is not unprecedented. And the half of the forecast run throws you into, say, a 70-30 box, where it may well be that you've already utilized the entire commercial allocation on that front side. So it's just another piece of uncertainty. That's my main concern. On principle, like I say, it makes perfect sense, but there's just, the reality is not always, it's not an academic exercise.
Commissioner Finley.
I guess I just want to make sure I understand the chart and the purpose of the first alternative, where we show a ex-vessel value of 0. That's a non-starter for Oregon. We have a statute that requires us to enhance both commercial and sport fishing. If I were going to the courthouse with you, I would, we have a quote here from Washington to say that alternative gears don't work, and that we knowingly adopted a program. So I think we have to be mindful that that's the real part, in my mind, of the difficulty between what we have to do with policy in Washington and statute in Oregon.
Commissioner Graybill.
Thank you, Commissioner Finley, for pointing that out. I believe when we originally sat down with Oregon on this policy, that at least when I got involved, the actual sharing for summer Chinook was 0, because 100% originated from the Upper River, and it was actually an Upper River proponent, that suggested that we do introduce an 80-20 share to help compensate for their losses to the commercial fleet on other species. So yes, I believe that there should be some access. However, again, getting back to what I've said earlier today, I just want to interject this into the discussion of summer fishing, is that in 2018, NOAA distributed a status of salmon stocks report and listed overfished and subject to overfishing stocks on the west coast. Overfished are the Sacramento River Fall Chinook, Klamath River Fall Run Chinook, Queets Coho, Juan de Fuca Coho, and Snohomish Coho, and subject to overfishing, which indicates that if we continue on this path, that we could probably reach listing, is Upper Columbia Summer Chinook. So again, I just want to restate my position that we need to proceed with caution.
Let me just briefly say, subject to overfishing, I think technically under the NOAA definitions is having a harvest rate that's too high for that particular year. If that kept going on for long enough, maybe there could be an ESA consideration.
Sure, we could distribute that definition.
Any other questions on this table before we hear the other parts of it, and then we can come back to the alternatives and see what would be narrowed? I might offer one comment. When Commissioner Finley indicated something was a non-starter in Oregon without alternate, because we don't have an alternative gear now that can work for summer Chinook. The tangle nets don't work because there's too many shad. There are sockeye and steelhead in the river, and the only commercial fishing gear that has proven, the best of the commercial gears to choose from seems to be the gill net. That is the kind of conversation that took place in February when the PRC ended up recommending gill net and alternative gear as a possible gear type. And I think the discussion back then was just to not close out the door for the future if some new alternative gear, floating fish trap or pound net or something might develop. So I'll just throw that in for some background because you weren't there in February. So, any other questions then on this analysis? I might just say I'm going to hold in the back of my mind the comments about no change in angler trips. When I look at this table, if you could actually not decrease the angler trips and have a large increase to the commercial fishery and achieve all your conservation goals, that would seem like a strong winner. But I still have in the back of my mind the difficulties that you have mentioned about estimating the angler trips. But let's move on to the next one.
So, Chair McIsaac, just to reiterate on that point, and we're all on the same page, but it's the linear pieces, what would have been rather than what it will be. So that's paraphrasing what you said.
Yeah, absolutely noted, it's not linear. I think you guys have made a great case about that. To presume it's zero. Actually, before we move on to the next one, this might be a good spot for a short break. So why don't we go ahead and take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:25, and we'll pick up the remainder of the summer Chinook.
provide examples. So jumping down the list to issue number 2, allocation of unused commercial impacts. I made mention that staff didn't have a write-up available for this meeting at this time. However, I can give you the bottom line, and we will provide those if you prefer prior to the next meeting, so you have them in advance of November 18th. But the bottom line on allocation of unused commercial impacts is if gill nets are allowed to be used, the commercial will use their share, or essentially 100%. If the gill nets are not allowed, and it's alternative gear only, for example, or no gill nets were allowed access, their share, they would use about 5%, and that's just that 5% comes from a few summer Chinook that end up in the select areas. So 95% of their share would move upstream and either get caught in sport fisheries, coal whale fisheries, or escape to the spawning ground. So the nuts and bolts of it is the gill net is kind of the key cog in how you deal with that if the commercials will access their share. So I'll pause there and see if that made sense. And we will distribute that after this meeting when we finalize that write-up.
Okay, any questions about the unused commercial impacts? Okay, then maybe if you could put on the screen the spreadsheet.
Excuse me, Chairman Isaac,
Joe.
if I could add just
go ahead.
it'd
Yeah,
take only 4 minutes. Issue 3, I just want to add a few more items. That's the allowable mainstem gear. What we have in the description we talked about right now, we have only had gill nets to use. We have tested purse and beach seines, and those have had high bycatch issues on sockeye, for example. So we have not prosecuted summer Chinook fisheries with beach or purse seines. Basically, would have a low ex-vessel value based on impacts accrued, like through sockeye, for example. We, if you look at the catch rates and assume mark rate for looking at a hook and line commercial fishery, based on the catch rates, it would likely be not profitable. And not captured in here is pound net, and I want to just make mention that we have not tested that fishery in the summer period. However, this last year, 2019, it was conducted under a research category for looking at mortality rates on sockeye. And so we don't have any analysis at this time to say one way or the other how it could fit in the summertime period. But just to let you know, we did have research conducting in the summer on pound net. So I just wanted to make mention of that. And that's all I have on issue 3.
Just a
Question,
yeah,
Commissioner
thank you. Thanks, Ryan. So, you know, for the beach seine and purse seine, you mentioned high encounters with sockeye and steelhead. What about, you know, there was an analysis done too looking at the survival of wild Chinook too. Was that, and there was an issue, as I recall, that the survival was less than what the assumption was based on, you know, when this policy went into effect. Is that true for summer Chinook, or is that more spring or fall, or?
Commissioner Kehoe, that's, I think what you're referring to on the mortality rate was for the fall Chinook. That's the only work we actually did any, you know, release mortality work on. The summer was
Summer, okay.
kind of constrained to a feasibility evaluation, which is basically summarized in these 2 tables shown. Okay. And basically what we found was, you know, fairly low catch rate of the target fish and a high catch rate on non-target fish, and especially sockeye and steelhead to some degree. So we didn't carry it forward.
So then, you know, even assuming you had 100% survival of non-targeted Chinook, wild Chinook, these other limiting factors would still make the fishery, at least with beach seines and purse seines, not practical, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's why staff has maintained that right now we just don't have a gear.
Okay, so I'll save my survival question for fall Chinook then. Thanks.
On your comment about pound nut experimenting this year, is there any grandiose or obvious conclusions from that testing, such as they never caught a fish, or they were swamped with shad, so it's just been awful, or something like that?
Interesting question. We didn't catch many shad under a very large run size this year, so location, probably. We did catch some Chinook and caught our target number of sockeye for the release mortality study and stayed, I don't recall the steelhead numbers, but stayed well within our expected impacts on that. So we were operating on the way it worked this year was the intention became focused on sockeye mortality rate. So it was hit that objective of, I can't remember if it was 500 fish encounters, but we were able to pull that one off.
And this was in the Skamakaway location?
The Cathlamet, yeah.
Cathlamet, okay.
Same location.
Okay. Well, could you put the alternatives and issues spreadsheet up there? And if we could look at summer Chinook for policy issues 1, there is the PRC recommendation. There's status quo that's not concurrent at the moment. There's 2 alternatives. For issue 2, there is this was not addressed by the PRC. There's 2 different perspectives currently, and there's 2 alternatives. And for allowable mainstem gear, there is a PRC recommendation, and there is currently a difference between the states that's not concurrent. So in terms of moving toward November, is there any suggestions from the committee about narrowing the range of alternatives? Okay, yes, Commissioner Finley, then Commissioner Aikenson.
When I pointed out the last chart, alternative 1, I think any alternative that's listed that doesn't meet our statutory requirements is an empty alternative. And so doesn't fairly inform the public. It's a thoughtful thing. It's graphic in nature of what could be. But if I were taking you to the courthouse, there's too much evidence out here of too many things said in public meetings and in public documents that it's an easy case to make.
Commissioner Aikenson?
I would agree with that, and I assume that Chair Finley is saying that the 80-20 with without the use of a viable or known alternative gear is not an alternative we want to keep on our list.
Yes.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, I agree, but the status quo is within statute. Is that correct? Am I correct, Commissioner Finley?
You know what? I've never looked at it through the eyes of litigation. So, I mean, seriously.
But it's been in place.
Yeah, and no one sued us.
It exists now by rule, so. And that's what I would advocate for.
I would say that's a good fallback plan.
Yes.
So just to make sure I know what is being deactivated then, up there and on our sheet for issue number 1, I see 80-20 Oregon. You're talking about deactivating that one? Is that right?
That's what my interpretation.
Yeah, mine too.
As a Washington commissioner, not from the chair's seat here, the abundance-based matrix has some interest from me. Commissioner Keogh mentioned the attractiveness of doing it. There are some difficulties in implementation, but you know, there may be a situation on very low run sizes where the allocation could be heavier to sport fishing, and at high abundance, heavier to commercial fishing. The difficulty is we do not have an abundance-based matrix to even look at right now to try to move to November. So that's some difficulty. Let me just stagnate that one for a moment. I'll move on to unused impacts, and I guess there's no PRC recommendation. If I was going to suggest to the group a way to trim these down to one, alternative 2, which says unused impacts allocated to upriver recreational fisheries or spawning escapement, seems to be the simplest one. The staff brought up the question related to gear, that if there is no gear that the commercial fishery can use, then there's going to be all of their impacts moving upstream. If the PRC recommendation of gill nets and any evolving alternative gear are allowed, then there might not be any, but there's always the chance that you get a late run that you don't know about, and maybe the commercial fishery can't take all their share. So I guess so there. I'm going to put out for discussion that for issue number 2, that we only consider alternative number 1 in November, and for issue number 3, that I'd ask whether, and I think what we just heard was scratching out alternative gear only is where the Oregon folks are at. So scratching out that is a possibility, which would only leave one alternative for gear, that being gill net and alternative. That's the current PRC recommendation. One alternative for allocation of unused impacts, and it says upriver recreational fisheries and or escapement, depending on how things flow as the fish move upriver. And I guess I won't say anything more about issue number 1. So that's just up for reaction from the PRC members about that kind of trimming.
I had one question for staff.
Yes.
I was wondering with the concept of the matrix, the way it's designed to have lower proportion commercial at low numbers and higher at high numbers. It seems to me in Oregon at least that we functionally do manage that way anyway, that if there's extra allocation from sport fishing unable to utilize that higher number, that allocation could potentially go to commercial fishermen. Is that true? Or is that not for the summer season?
Commissioner Atkinson, I believe in the last year since the policy was implemented, we utilized the adaptive management provision and transferred summer Chinook allocation from the sport to the non-treaty commercial 1 year, and then for spring Chinook we did it in 2 years, I believe. And that occurs when we can project that the recreational fishery won't need or utilize its full allocation, which is a little challenging because some of the summer fisheries occur much farther upstream and later, so it's a little hard, earlier in the season when the lower river can access the fish to know that you won't use them. I think that occurred when we had the largest run size upgrade ever.
But isn't there already a matrix on above Priest River and below Priest River? So on those higher run sizes, there's a higher proportion of fish to utilize in the lower river. which even compounds that greater increase of fish available in the lower river.
Yeah, that's accurate, and it's, excuse me, it's shown on this table on page 6 in the summer Chinook. The complication that John was referring to is based on the fact that in all years, the majority, well, no, that's not, on most run sizes, the majority of the harvest goes above Prc. I mean, that's the priority.
Right.
So those fisheries haven't yet occurred, so it can be challenging to use impacts in any lower river fishery before those have even.
Because that really is part of the Columbia River
Yes,
impact.
yes,
Got it.
yes.
Okay, I see that.
So I just had a question for you, Mr. Chair. So, you know, for the allocation of unused commercial impacts, I don't think I heard you. So are you suggesting that we do not consider alternative 1 anymore, just the unused impacts allocated to spawning escapement? Or, I guess I didn't hear you.
Yeah, correct. No, I was suggesting scratch alternative 1, scratch current status quo.
On the straight across, not the up and down. You're talking about number 1. Those alternative ones that are listed on the right are different and not connected to the horizontal numbers. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, let me try it this way. I'm gonna just speak to the row, so the horizontal for allocation of unused commercial impacts.
For summer Chinook.
For summer Chinook. It has yet to have a PRC recommendation, and I'm not advancing one now, I'm saying, but what alternative do we want to think about in November? Let's not consider the current non-concurrent one that's in gold. So maybe X that one out, my suggestion. Alternative 1, X that one out. Unused impacts allocated solely to spawning escapement.
No, I
And-
guess I'm confused too.
I'm going horizontally on, do we have a pointer here? There we go, here's a pointer. So Holly, if you could look up at the board
Yeah.
here, I'm talking about this row here.
Right.
Computer out of
And
the
you're
way.
talking about only going to that alternative 2 and not the pink or the yellow or the alternative 1.
Correct.
I guess I would like to discuss that further in light of all the comments that we received today regarding concern about conservation. And we heard from Commissioner Graybill that there was a concern about not getting enough fish back to those spawning areas for the wild fish. If that's the case, why would we not say that the unused impacts would be allocated to spawning escapement, which would give us a buffer that's just an extra buffer to those fish?
Yeah, that's a good question. Here's my rationale, that how much can be taken has been the subject of some conservation scrutiny in US v. Oregon and prior to this table. And they have settled on an amount that could be safely taken. Safely taken, I don't know if that's the right word. It's an amount for which there's a recognition that there's a lot of harvestable components to the summer Chinook run. There's a hatchery component. There's several wild components, a couple of which haven't been making their spawning escapement goals, and maybe the largest chunk of wild fish goes somewhere other than those 3 tributaries. But my rationale is, prior to this table, there's been some thinking about what's okay amount to be taken. And that I'm not going to second guess that or try to change that. And if that's okay, but there happens to be some commercial fish that didn't get captured in the lower river let those fish move upstream. The fishing power in the recreational fishery is unlikely to take all of those. So some of them will go to a sport catch wherever it's open, and some of them will go to the spawning escapement either in the main stem of the Columbia or in one of those couple of 3 tributaries. So there'll be some spread there. To say that you have to protect them all the way up the river, I think starts to become some sort of a management challenge. What fisheries would have to be closed to protect them, passing through fish.
Well, it wouldn't affect the sport fishery at all, because they already have be managed for their allocation. So it shouldn't make any in-season changes to the sport fishery.
Well, the sport fishery, I believe in these situations where you're making your pre-rapid spawning escapement goal, is that mainstem area is open. Totally, all the time. So you would be capturing some of the unused commercial fish because it's
Don't
open.
we fish to the impacts? So once the sport fishing impact is 70% and commercial's 30, and commercial only used 25, the sport fishery still has 70 as their impacts. And so that shouldn't affect the season for sport fishermen one way or the other.
Well, what I'm saying is if the sport fishery is open, it will catch some of the fish allocated to the recreational fishery, and it will catch some of those unused commercial fish.
I have a question.
I don't think so.
Are any of these fish that we're talking about marked select?
Go ahead. Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but go ahead.
Yes, the sport fishery is mark selective, the coal oil fishery, partial mark selective, depends on what component, so yes.
So depending on the drainage and the stock, you might want some sport fishermen in there with barbless hooks, releasing these wild fish and keeping the hatchery fish so they're not up there reproducing, right?
Either way, barbed or barbless is the same, but yeah, that's true.
No, I'm thinking more about precluding the sport fishing as an option where you actually want sport fishing.
Yeah. I was just going to offer, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives the managers flexibility, I think, to, for the situations that Chair Finley mentioned to, prosecute a fishery. I would certainly like to hear Commissioner Graybill's viewpoint on this. And then I guess my question would be, what was the genesis for Oregon's policy, if you will, of all unused impacts go to escapement? Is it a function because there are not fisheries that you folks are too concerned about taking place in Washington? I guess that would be.
Well, I was involved in that discussion
Okay.
in Oregon, and at the time, one of the reasons that I felt it was important to go to spawning escapement was because this was tied with having no alternative gear for the commercial fishermen. So if they can't use their allocation every year, then that's it by default going to the sport fishermen anyway.
Okay.
And so to me, that was an unfair way to give sport fishermen another 20% for free.
Okay. But so then, if I may, Chair, follow up with a back and forth. So then if the PRC then recommendation finally adopted no longer has the alternative gear only mandate, then does that
That's a
ease your
significant
concerns?
improvement to
Okay.
me, yes, that does make me feel much more flexible, that this isn't a disciplinary thing for a way to steal allocation. So I'm not feeling the same as I was when there was no option for commercial fishermen. But I was just responding to what everybody keeps saying, is they think that there's, we should do more for conservation. And Commissioner Graybill is concerned about the spawning. So are you more concerned about making sure the spawning areas have enough return? Or are you more concerned about your recreational fishermen getting those extra fish?
No, the escapement is my primary concern. And I believe, I'll reiterate, Bob, that I introduced in this process the ability to access these summer runs by commercial fishermen. And if we have the assurance that we're going to make our escapement goals, then I'm satisfied. And because of the constraints to commercial fishery during that summer period, I am comfortable with that.
So you're okay with alternative 2 then, I take it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just checking.
Yeah.
So alternative 2 sort of means we give staff the leeway to decide when and where to
Yes.
allocate escapement. Is that correct? Based
There
on
is
that?
some flexibility there.
Yeah, is that
Okay.
what it means?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm comfortable with that then.
Okay. Is there any additional analysis on summer Chinook that anybody would like the staff to take a look at? Chris?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Could I just get a recap of the 3 rows?
Thank you.
Please?
Yeah. And I may have misspoken in the first part of it here, so let's start at the bottom. Issue number 3, that the PRC recommendation of February 26th stays and it continues, moves to November. But the current alternative that is a non-concurrent one would not. And there are no alternatives. Under issue number 2, the only one that would move forward for further consideration would be alternative 2. The one we just spoke of. Under the allocation, got a question about that?
What is the allocation on alternative 2?
Well, let me get to that one. Okay, so that would be irrespective of the allocation.
Okay.
Irrespective of whatever the allocation is,
Right.
any unused commercial impacts would be allocated as such.
Okay.
Now, what is
Understood.
the allocation? I think what I heard from Oregon was 80-20 with nothing but alternative gear. It was a non-starter, but that not necessarily 80-20 should be stricken. I said that earlier, and that I don't know that was accurate. Right now, I haven't heard anybody say any of those would be eliminated from further consideration. The abundance-based matrix is one where I'm still wondering whether or not to have a staff assignment come back and say something like, well, for run sizes under 60,000, it's 80-20. From 60 to 85, it's 70-30, and at the highest abundance over 90, it's something different. But I don't know if I want to, if we get to the end of the day and the staff has a whole bunch of assignments, I don't know that I would still be behind having that one be there. Now, but I do have to say, as a Washington commissioner, I am more comfortable with some sort of a gradation there than I am with 50-50 or the straight percentage. That's just where I'm at. But that's
Where I'm at is to be concurrent with Oregon presently, is with their 80-20. And with the caveat to spawning escapement. So it would be consistent with Oregon's current rule.
okay. We're kind of looking for consensus to narrow the options. Maybe there isn't any consensus on this one.
Don't
There
think
probably
so.
isn't. I guess my thought is that I understand the staff's concern about the complexity of a matrix, and I agree that I like the concept of it, but I think it might be unfair to give the staff that complexity where they say, okay, this year it's 50-50, and then a month later, no, it's 70-30, and we've already gone over something. But I would like to keep this open on the 50-50, because what we've seen on the economics, that's not harmful to the number of sport fishermen, and it increases the economics 70% by going from a 70-30, which is our current PRC, to the 50-50. So I'd like to keep the 50-50 open, maybe even partly because that could be a substitute for the matrix, which may be too complex to address the same situation, but would still provide good opportunity for commercial fishermen without impact to sport fishermen.
Yeah.
Commissioner Keith.
So let me just say, and I think I made this point before, but so it's difficult to look at these allocations on an individual basis. I mean, I think, you know, ideally you'd like to see the full suite and see how it shakes out. But having said that, I mean, I know, if we did that, then we would be here forever. And so, I have to concur with Chair McIsaac. Just that abundance-based matrix has appealed to me, and I acknowledge the director's concerns over that, but still, I mean, and I don't know how much work it would be involved in staff, because my understanding is that, at least in the past, this fishery was based, managed, you know, using, and correct me if I'm wrong, on some sort of matrix. Oh, no, okay, so I am wrong. I see. That was summer. Oh, that's spring, okay, yeah, so never in the summer, okay, well, I guess I'm wrong there, first time today, only time. But, I mean, just to me, it does have an appeal, and I like it better than the 50-50 straight. I think the 50-50, it's, I mean, if we could capture that abundance in a way that's workable, that would be my preference. But if it's not doable, that's a non-starter, so.
Yes, go ahead.
Isn't the summer fishery a pretty small number of fish relative to spring and fall? As far as the economic contributions, I think it's only a couple % contribution to the,
Yeah.
the total economics.
I think it's only 5% at the max.
Cindy LaFleur, comment?
I just wanted to clarify, what we're talking about is allocation below Bonneville Dam only. Remember, most of these fish are harvested above Prc Rapids Dam in recreational fisheries and Colville tribal fisheries. So first of all, you've got a big chunk going upriver. Then you have a smaller chunk that's allocated between sport and commercial fisheries downstream of Bonneville. And the table in here was referencing, the angler trips was referencing below Bonneville, right, John? Angler trips only. So there's another whole piece up above there.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think it's important to remember that this is the smallest piece that's getting shared, because the biggest piece goes above. That was our, you know, we prioritized summer Chinook in the upper river.
That's helpful.
Very helpful. Chris Kern.
Just one quick clarification. The allocation decision does actually affect the middle river between Bonneville and Priest Rapids as well. It's a much smaller fishery. We don't have the angler trips captured in there, but it is a piece of this.
So,
Well, let me- yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I mean, I think this discussion kind of goes to my point. It's difficult to look at these in isolation, you know. Myself, I think it might make sense to give and I'll just throw out this, to go, 80/20 recreational with maybe a higher allocation on the fall. I mean, that's,
Well-
so, and I know so that's where I think at the end of the day, that's where I'd like to see kind of how it all lines up. But, so, yeah, I mean, I think 80/20 is on the table, 70/30 for me, 50/50. I don't know if we're going to be able to pare it down today, but.
Well, I believe that was the discussion in 2016. It was 80/20 in the summer and then 70/30 in the fall.
I would go north of that, though, Dave.
Oh, well, I would.
Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe we're not going to be able to narrow the range.
I don't think it matters if we don't.
Yeah, so let's move on. That would keep, as summary, it would keep 70/30. In November, we'd be looking at 70/30 being considered, 80/20 being considered, 50/50 being considered, and an undefined abundance-based matrix being considered. And I would not ask the staff, I was going to ask the staff to analyze a simple one, but I wanted to leave that possibility for November. Cindy LaFleur?
I was just gonna suggest if, I'm not trying to give us assignments, but if you give us some flexibility on the abundance-based, that might be one way for us to tackle that. And, these reference tables are in here on these abundance-based scenarios for summer Chinook that are already present. And I think there might have been a comment in here that says, if you're gonna build one, make sure it matches in some way what you've already got, and you don't put another category in there. And then the other comment I was gonna say is, we have a lot of abundance-based matrices in the Columbia River and in the ocean and all of our fisheries. And one of the latest ones we adopted was a coho abundance-based matrix. And we learned from our previous work that simpler is better. And that matrix is just a 2x2 or it has many fewer cells, so it's a lot easier to work with. And if we can have some ability for the staff to look at a very simple, maybe it's just you reach a certain number, run size, and the allocation changes, and it could be as simple as that. So, anyway, if you give us some flexibility, maybe we can come up with some ideas.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. And I had been thinking of saying under 50, under 50, 80/20, 50 to 100, 70/30, and over 100, 50/50. But you guys pegging it to your current numbers. Okay, I think.
Congratulations, Cindy, you have another assignment.
I have enemies down the road here, I know that right now.
Great job.
I don't see John smiling.
I couldn't see you guys giving this up, so.
Okay, are we ready for fall Chinook then?
Yes.
Okay, I guess that one's mine. I will step through, you should have a handout with titled Fall Chinook near the top. I'll just briefly touch on a little bit of background. We have two issues on that subject, allocation and an allowable gear and area. On background on the allocation part, when we're talking here, we're talking about ESA impacts for two Chinook stocks, the lower Columbia River Tules and the Snake River Upriver Bright Chinook, and it's an allocation between the non-treaty recreational and commercial fisheries. Either of these two Chinook stocks can be a primary constraint for fall fisheries downstream of Bonneville. The Upriver Bright stock would be the constrainer above Bonneville, since they don't have the lower river Tules in that area. And the fall is very complicated, which we'll get into moving forward. Current status, as a reminder, we have the February PRC recommendation, which is also the Washington policy and is also the current Oregon policy, so we're calling that full concurrence, and that is that commercial fisheries receive no less than or greater than or equal to 30% of the most constraining Chinook stock, and recreational fisheries receive less than or equal to 70%. We still have alternative 1 on the table, which was the original long-term harvest reform, which had a 80-20 sharing, and then we have alternative 2, which has changed the sharing for sport and commercial to less than or equal to 65, greater than or equal to 35. Moving to page 2 of that handout, our second issue for fall Chinook is the allowable mainstem commercial gears. Little background, recently non-treaty commercial fisheries targeting fall Chinook in the mainstem have been using the gill nets in zones 4-5. Initially that was to maximize the harvest of Chinook per Thule fall Chinook ESA impact, and later that was kind of mandated by policy changes in terms of the area. And gill netting still remains permitted in the fall season, as are alternative gears. Our current status is, we have a February PRC recommendation, which is the current Washington policy that allows gill net, tangle net, and seine gear with no restrictions on fishing zones. Our alternative 1, which matches the current Oregon policy, is to allow the use of gill nets and other alternative gears, but gill nets would be limited to zones 4 and 5. And another alternative on the table, which matches the original long-term harvest reform intent, is to just allow the use of alternative gears only, no restriction on the fishing zones, but it would be assumed that those gears would be focused in zones 1 through 3. So moving to results for issue 1, the allocation, we have a table we prepared. It basically is similar to what we presented for summer Chinook, where we show the expected average angler trips. Now this is below Bonneville only, and the reason for that is we haven't had a creel program above Bonneville until recently, so you can't go back and remodel these things when you didn't have the data. So this analysis is restricted to below Bonneville. So what we have here is in the table is basically, it's difficult to, or it's impossible to calculate the commercial ex-vessel value without pairing the allocation and the gear. You can't calculate a value just for all gear or just for an allocation. So the table kind of bundles the allowable gear with the based on the expected allocation scenario. So in issue 1, alternative 2, well, the first option, that's a 80-20 share using alternative gear only, and the modeling based on going back and redoing what occurred 2013 through 18 would show about 216,000 angler trips under that scenario, and a commercial ex-vessel value of about 780,000. I would note that because there was only seining allowed in 3 years, and those were 3 very high Chinook years, the 780,000 is probably optimistic because it's modeled just on the results for the years we had the fishery, and those, we're not going to have over 1 million Chinook often going forward, so it's probably optimistic. Under the second option, which is a 70-30, and assuming large mesh gill net and some alternative gears, the angler trips drops about 4,000 angler trips under that scenario, but the commercial ex-vessel value increases to 1.6 million approximately. And under the third option, which was a 65-35 with the same commercial gears, there's a slight drop in the recreational angler trips and about a 300,000 increase in the commercial ex-vessel value. And again, with all these modeling, this is based on what we have seen since the policy was adopted. It doesn't mean this is exactly what would happen going forward, but it's our staff's best, what would you say? It's the best estimate based on what we have in data available to us. So overall, the modeling, indicates a significant gain in Mainstem ex-vessel commercial value as the commercial share increases in the fall and also when gillnet gear is allowed. Again, on the angler trips, we saw there was an increase with allocation, but like with other fisheries, the gains were not linear. We did include on the middle of page 4 some explanation on the nonlinear sport trips, because that's just such a complicated concept to understand. You would think that it would be linear, but there's basically the same thing occurred. There's just bigger factors at play than what we initially thought back in the initial modeling in 2012-13. Trying to think if I missed anything. One other point to note, that expansion of under the option 1, which shows about 780,000 if it was alt gear only. It's worth noting that this would require about a 15-time fold increase in either the effort or the catch from what was observed in 2014 through 16, and that actually would be quite an increase, because those runs were extremely large Chinook runs, so getting 15 times higher catch rate would not be likely, and achieving 15 times the effort would put that would be about the same number of seine operations as we have gillnet fishermen right now. So that, I guess what I'm pointing out is that it's modeled as that, but you have to kind of check and see if it's it's real, and that's what I was trying to point out.
Okay, any questions on this table? Once again, it's a mix of allocations and the allocation issue as well as the gear issue. Commissioner Key.
Yeah, thanks. So, John, you may have answered this already, but I didn't track you. So, I'm looking at Table 1, right? Issue 1, Alternative 1, Issue 2, Alternative 2, which is no Mainstem gillnet gear, alternative gear only, and then you have 779,000. So, but I look at Table 2, and I'm just looking at the beach seine and per seine fishery values combined for 14, 15, 16. Okay, so I see 17, that's the high water mark here. So is that what you're saying, where you have 922,305? Is that number highly influencing the 779 that we see on Table 1 for the alternative gear? That's my first question.
That's gillnet.
The 922 you're looking at is
Oh,
the
that's
value of the
gillnet.
gillnet
Oh,
fishery.
yeah, okay, yeah.
But you did touch on an important subject when, Table 2 captures the actual values observed for the seine fisheries, and they're significantly less than the model
Yes.
780. What I was trying to get at was that the 780 is basically, if you took all of the commercial impacts and you applied them, to alt gear only, what we're doing in this modeling is scaling up what we actually observe. So it says, if you took all those impacts on average, you would make about 780,000, but the checkpoint is that real? And what I was trying to point out is, to get there, you would have to have 15 times either the effort, the catch, or some combination thereof, which is
So if
It's
the
just a
whole fleet-
reality
if
check.
the whole fleet converted,
To purse seine, yeah, that was gonna be my question. So how many are you assuming, how many purse seines are you assuming operations in this 779,000 figure?
Yeah, I don't have the specifics, but if you go back to table 2, like you observed, we provide the number of fishers that were involved in those. I don't have the number of operations, but.
Okay, so 17,
But
20.
basically, if the catch rate stayed the same, you would have to have 15 times the number of individuals here, in a sense. I mean, it would have to be
Yeah.
a large seine fishery to achieve that value, is what we're trying to get at. But.
Okay. Well,
Now,
if we go with that, if the PRC were to go to that, then there might be a good market for purse seine vessels, so maybe I should vote.
Good try.
It's important to note, though, that in this modeling, any alternative gear, such as seines here, is considered to be mark selective fishery, whereas when we're talking gillnet zones 4, 5, that's a non-selective fishery.
Yeah. So the purse seines would be limited to mark selective, whereas the recreational fishery in the fall, my understanding is based on some of the earlier testimony, is not selective, not mark selective. It's catch what you keep.
Correct. The presumptive path
Keep what you
early
catch.
on was that, these alternative gears would be used to modify the PHOS so they'd be focused on
I see.
hatchery stocks, and so we continued that modeling concept here.
I've used my time, Mr. Chair.
okay. Any other questions? We jumped to table 2 during that. Is there anything else you'd like to point out on table 2 or anything else of your analysis for fall Chinook?
Well, actually, after we sent out this packet last week, Director Melcher asked that we include some information on PoundNet. So we attempted to modify this. Oh, this is the modified version of Table 2. So this is labeled 2A with a handout coming around.
While they're handing that out, let me go back to your 779 number. You've qualified that several times, but if that is a whole bunch of purse seines and beach seines fishing in the river, all of which are only retaining marked fish, that's a lot of fish, a lot of marked fish being caught to generate almost $800,000. There is enough hatchery fish to do that and still make our statement?
The fall is extremely complicated, and as we start to enter it, you're asking really good questions. I think there is, just off the cuff. I mean, but there's so many ways you can model these things and look at it. You can look at non-mark selective seine. But we tried to stick with the original concept, which was, when this was all designed, the alternative gears were supposed to focus on hatchery removals, primarily lower river. Subsequent to that, we have looked at, what if it was alternative gears, but it was non-mark selective. Some of that is presented in, I think, the Oregon report that's been provided, and it gets pretty complex, but.
Okay, you didn't catch more than the run size, though.
No, it doesn't assume that.
Okay.
So with that handout, let's see, Table 2A. Okay, there's a lot of information in this table. I hope I can get through it, but the simplest way to look at it is this is just the results, basically the observed results with 2 exceptions, which I'll get to, for gillnet, purse seine, beach seine, and PoundNet since 2014 to 2018. The first 4 or 5 columns are just observed data. This is the number of days that people fished for each fishery. This wasn't the open days because there was, in some years there was more open days for seine than people actually went. This was just the days they went fishing. The average number of fishers that participated on any given day in that year in fishery, their actual harvest, and the ex-vessel value. And then to the right, since these fisheries are on such different magnitudes, in order to be able to compare them, we kind of standardized and provided a few metrics so that it makes it easier for you to compare between the fisheries. So we provided 3 metrics. One is the value per fisher day, which is higher for the gillnet fishery, I think, in all years, since basically there's just fewer people involved. The seine and beach, perch seine and beach seine had an average of about 4 fishers per operation. In this analysis, we assumed 1 for per gillnet boat. It could be slightly higher than that, but it doesn't really change the outcome much. And for per pound net, which I'll get to in a second, we assume 3 fishers needed. That's what Wild Fish Conservancy said in their report. The second metric column we provided was just value for salmon, and what you'll see is that the fish caught in the zone 4-5 gillnet fishery are almost always higher value. That's because alt years tend to have a higher percent coho in their catch, which are lower value. They tend to have a higher percent tule, Chinook stock in their catch, which are lower value. They tend to have a lower average weight and a lower price per pound. So when you combine all that, you generally see that fish caught in alternative gears are worth less than the fish caught in the zone 4-5 gillnet fishery. And the third metric we provided was kind of an index of selectivity, if you will. This is just the dollars generated per natural origin or wild bee steelhead mortality. And this is provided just to show basically some of the things we're looking at in terms of steelhead were never considered in the original policy, and since then it's become more of an issue. Wild bee steelhead of restricted fisheries the last 3 years, or they've been a constraint the last 3 years and periodically before that, so it's something kind of important to look at. And what this shows, this just helps show what value can be generated in commercial fisheries per impact of wild bee steelhead. And the impact is calculated as the estimated handle times the mortality rate. Those 2 things work in concert. You can have a low release mortality rate, but if your handle is really high, you still end up with significant mortalities. Now, one thing I wanted to point out was the pound net only operated commercially in 2018. But to try and provide a little more information, what we did was we used the ratio of value per fish between the gill net and the pound net in 18 and created hypothetical values for the 16 and 17 Cathlamet pound net fish that were handled, because we know what they handled, we just didn't have a sold value, so we created a hypothetical value, and that once you have the value, then you can calculate these other metrics. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, thank you. Questions about this table? What is the B-run steelhead mortality for the Cathlamet pound net again?
We use, so TAC has not adopted official rates for any pound net fish yet. We used the 5.6% that the Wild Fish Conservancy reported in their from their work, and what's currently being used for by TAC for research impact calculations.
Okay. Commissioner Aikenson.
I just had a comment relative to staff. It seems like using some of these values here, like value per salmon and value per steelhead impact, are really important in comparing the different gear types. And I know we've talked about putting some kind of table or some information in our PRC report that compares the different gear types, but it seems like some of this is really important information because people often are very confused about, you know, which gear type is good or bad, and they often only look at the mortality rate and not the handle times mortality rate. And it seems like if we could get that information in print of what that actually is, it might clarify the true impacts of the different gear types so people understand that better.
Agreed. Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Comment.
This is Exhibit A for the plaintiff, plus the statements that John made about the revenue. So again, I just remind everyone that we have an obligation to enhance commercial fisheries, not diminish.
Well, on that note then, why don't you put up the matrix of issues and alternatives, and let's have a discussion about refining this for further consideration in November, and then if there is any further assignments to staff that need to be done between now and November. So we have two rows here, one on allocation and one on gear. I see up in here where the pointer's at that there's a little dotted line about alternative gear only and gill nets in zones 4 and 5. That refers to the analysis, I presume, as opposed to them being tied to the allocation period. So, so what about maybe trying the easier one first? This would be allowable mainstem commercial gear. Is there any feelings from the committee about refining that? I would note also that it wasn't spoken to, but in our written material, there's a recommendation from the staff to remove tangle nets from the list of gear types since they are not a viable gear for targeting fall Chinook. So when we look at alternative gear only, maybe it's time to get clear whether, in my mind anyway, are tangle nets considered alternative gear, or should we just say gill nets, tangle nets, and alternative gear means all the rest of purse seines, beach seines, pound nets, and yet to be invented alternative gear?
We've had a lot of confusion on this, and I personally would prefer that we spell it out. Gill net, tangle net, and alternative gear could be, like you said, something we haven't even found yet. Purse seines, beach seines, pound nets.
Okay.
Chris?
Chris?
Ron?
Warren?
Thank you, Chairman Kazik. Just to add some clarity to what Cindy was saying, we're currently going through legislative process on emerging commercial fisheries for the pound net and identifying other gear types that can be used so we have statutory coverage. So spelling it out is going to be very important for us to do that in this process.
Let me ask if you could clarify the PRC's recommendation of February 26th, which says gill net for gear. Gill net, any zone, and alternative gear. Back then, did we mean to exclude tangle nets at that time and use this more specific definition of alternative gear? Do you recall?
Well, haven't we used tangle nets in the fall or no? No, that's just for Chinook, for coho.
Correct, we use we're using tangle nets now for coho.
Okay.
This is fall Chinook directed and can't see
Targeted.
a way to do that. And I don't think it was really ever included in the suite of things we were going to look at when we developed the policy in the beginning. It wasn't, we were looking at gill nets and then alternative gears for fall Chinook.
Okay. Chris Kern.
So I think if I go back to when we started this line a minute ago, you referenced, Chair McIsaac, that we had talked about, we don't currently think tangle nets is a gear for fall Chinook. I'm trying to, so a couple of options would be you could just say alternative gear, and that would include tangle nets if for some reason we found a way to use them down the road, it wouldn't preclude it. You could, if needed, to leave tangle net in there for specificity for other options. I think that's not a harmful thing so long as you don't expect that we're going to use it for something in the near term in the modeling. Just so we're clear on what that expectation is. That seems to be the primary issue, not the others. I don't know if that helps.
Okay.
Can I just,
Yes,
a
go
little
ahead.
comment? I guess then, I'm thinking maybe we don't have to specifically eliminate it, since we're not also eliminating seines or pound nets or anything else, but staff kind of decides what is viable or not.
Right.
But
In hindsight, we should have probably just left it off of there because, I mean, if the PRC decides that that kind of gear could be used, it's better to have more options, and who knows where we'll be in 10, 20 years. Maybe we'll find a way to use a different tangle net. I mean, limiting options is not the best. It's better to have more options, so.
Okay. Commissioner Kehoe.
So, back to your original question, Mr. Chairman, I think in line with Commissioner Finley's comments, I would propose eliminating alternative gear only from further consideration. And my reason being is, notwithstanding that $780,000 figure that we see for alternative gear, I think not to question John's analysis, but I think there's a lot of assumptions upon assumptions upon assumptions upon assumptions on that one. So I'm not real comfortable with that number. No criticism intended on that. So I just throw it out to the group, remove alternative gear only from the suite of options under consideration for fall Chinook.
Sure. Any objection to that? Okay, let's scratch that one off then. We have limiting gill nets to zones 4 and 5 and alternative gear as another option here. Is there a desire to keep that one in or narrow this out of that? That's the current Oregon.
That's the current rule
For Oregon.
for Oregon. Yeah, I'd like to keep that.
Okay, then no consensus to remove that then. In terms of our prior PRC recommendation, if we're looking for making sure whether or not it's understood, that includes tangle nets. You know, my memory back then was, I remember thinking about gill nets and everything else.
Sure.
And so, is there anybody who would object to specifying their gill net any zone and alternative gear, including tangle nets? Now, when I say that out loud, I don't want to try to leave the public with a perception that we're hoping to try tangle nets, you know, when we know during the fall Chinook target time and area when we know there are steelhead there, but I don't want to preclude experimentation either. So, Cindy LaFleur?
just had a thought. How about if we kind of define alternative gear as tangle net, purse seine, beach seine, pound net, and that gets to Ron's need for pound net being specified also. And yeah, I mean, we could,
Okay. Ron Warren?
Friendly amendment might be that you put an et cetera on the end of that, because we don't want to limit ourselves to that only if it were to be adopted at a later time by the commissions.
Okay. Go ahead.
I agree, let's help Ron.
There you go.
Instead of et cetera, could you say, or other alternative gears that have been approved by the departments, or something that indicates you've agreed that that's what you want?
Chris Kern?
How about including but not limited to?
Yeah.
As approved by the commissions.
there you go.
Okay. And if you could put that in a footnote to this table, because the word tangle net shows up in a whole bunch of other spots too. So, but if we now consider the word alternative gear as footnoted to be tangle nets, not limited to include that, and creative solutions yet to be seen.
So, I'm just looking at the PRC recommendation for gear type and gillnet any zone. So I guess my question is for staff is, did we allow mainstem gillnets in any zone other than zone 4 and 5 for the fall Chinook season this year?
Commissioner Kehoe, for this year, it was only zones 4 or 5 for large mesh fall Chinook fishery.
And maybe can you explain why that was? I mean, because you did have the flexibility to go in other zones, so was it just?
Commissioner Kehoe, with the mixed policies, we've generally been managing to the most constraining, and if I'm not mistaken, the Oregon policy still restricted fishing to zone 4 or 5, even though the PRC recommendation was different. In addition, it's kind of how the fishery has evolved over time with so little Thule impacts. The fishery, even before the policy started, tried to transition upstream to maximize their value per available impact, especially in relation to Thule's.
As I recall the discussion back in February, it was a matter of flexibility for the future. Thule's have been a problem for a number of years, but you know, you could have a situation where zone 2 in late September, after the Thule's have cleared, could be a coho and a Chinook fishery if there's a large coho run, and that's the tail end of the upper rights. And so it was just a question of leaving it open for flexibility, and it matched the transition language too, I think. It was.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm just thinking about moving forward and, you know, as you said, Chair, signaling to the public, you know, if we leave it open to all zones, are we sending perhaps the wrong message? I mean, I don't know, I mean, so, you know, that's kind of, you lay it out there and the public says, well, look, they're gonna have mainstem gilling and below the Lewis River, and, you know, that's gonna be the end of the world, and, I mean, I'm kind of struggling with that, and I understand the need for flexibility and looking in the future, but, you know, at the end of the day, hopefully our goal is that we get both commissions to sign on to this, and so, I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there as a kind of a dilemma.
Yeah, let me just say, it is a dilemma, and I've seen some characterizations of what the recommendation February 26th was that say it reopened gill netting year-round in the Columbia River.
Right.
I've heard
Yeah.
that said.
Yeah.
That was said as recently as July. And after a year-round opener, there's been a grand total of no days set. And after a year-round opener right now, there's been 4 days set. So there's plenty of room for mischaracterization out there that'll probably happen.
And
That's what Commissioner Aikenson was bringing up earlier too. about
Yeah.
Maybe we need some sort of fact sheet that goes along with this to do it. Commissioner Finley.
It may not be the wrong message, but it'll be a message. And I agree with the fact sheet. We need to put out information.
Okay, how about refining the allocation? We have, without referring to the less than or equal tos and greater than or equal to, 70-30, 80-20, 65-35. Is there any interest at the front table of removing any of those for consideration?
Well, again, for the sake of concurrency, the 70-30 in Oregon and Washington is currently ruled. I'd like to keep that.
Yeah, I agree too. For other reasons.
Any interest in removing 80-20 or 65-35 at this time?
Well, I'm thinking back from when we did look at the numbers on the 80-20, the commercial values on that were extremely poor, and as I recall, the PRC recommendation that we voted on kind of squeaked into being, in the next 4 or 5 years, being viable as far as being at least equivalent to the past commercial fishing values. So I don't think if we had an 80-20 that we'd be able to mix that into the other seasons and still maintain economic viability relative to what our policy is telling us we need to do. So I think we could eliminate that one at this time.
I think we can also eliminate the 65-35 too.
Well,
Okay, so first of all, on the 80-20, is there any objection to removing that or deactivating that one? On the 65-35, is there a consensus to deactivate that one?
I would like to keep that open as an option, again, to see where we sort out on some of these other ones, to ensure that we have some options that meet our policy requirements for adaptive management.
I concur completely with,
Yeah,
that was the point that I was
Okay.
trying to make earlier, I think, so. And Commissioner Aikenson said it much more succinctly and better than I did, so, thanks.
Okay, good, so we're making some progress here. Fall Chinook then, let me just try to recap. For issue 1 on allocation, the 70-30 remains forwarded to November for consideration, as well as the 65-35. For allowable gear, it would be gillnet any zone and alternative gear as footnoted, as well as gillnet zones 4 and 5 and alternative gear. Well, gillnets zones 4 and 5 and alternative gear anywhere. Is that the current Oregon rule, or is it just
I think
zones
so.
4 and 5?
I think it's anywhere.
Anywhere, okay. And alternative gear anywhere. Okay, well, that's 2 of the 4 species, and we have the other measures there, so this is good progress. It's about 1/4 to noon. What if we broke a little early for lunch? What would that mean to
You may not have it.
is that,
Give Ryan a head start to make some sandwiches, so go.
Done.
is that possible? Okay. Well, then let's go ahead and, this is kind of a working lunch, but why don't we take a break for a half an hour, and if we are all done earlier than that, we can get started. So, 12:15.